Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, we'd like to welcome you to today's extended day-ahead market congestion revenue allocation phase 2 stakeholder working group meeting. My name is Christina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. I'm joined in the room by Milos Bosanak and Guillermo Bautista Alderete, and online by James Lynn and George Angelides and Phil Roth. Just a few friendly reminders before we get started. Today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And as a reminder, this slide deck is posted online on our EDAM Congestion Revenue Allocation webpage. And this meeting recording will be posted there soon as well, along with the comment template. This meeting is intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives, so please keep your comments professional and respectful today. Also, please try to keep your comments and questions succinct so that we have time to hear from everyone. For those of you online, you can access closed captioning on the bottom left of your screen and Inteller Transparency Viewer on the bottom right hand of your screen. Just be sure to refresh before viewing the Transparency Viewer. And we welcome and look forward to your engagement participation today. Here's some additional instructions for raising your hand. The raise hand icon is directly at the bottom of your WebEx screen. If you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device to join the questions queue. And you can also send in your comments and questions via chat. Just select all panelists, and then we can read your question aloud. Please remember to state your name and affiliation first before making any comments. And if you are needing any technical assistance anytime during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer in Inteller Events. Today's agenda includes some meeting objectives and an introduction from Milos Bosanak. Then the team will begin a discussion on design concept number 3. Then we will wrap up for the day with next steps. So with that, I will go ahead and turn things over to Milos Bosanak to get us started.
Thank you, Christina, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another working group meeting on EDAM congestion revenue allocation. 2 weeks ago or so, we met and really focused the discussion on design concept number 1. We were intending on starting some aspects of discussions on concept number 3, but we had a good dialogue and robust participation that we used up the full 3 hours on concept design 1, along with some of the analysis that Guillermo and his team performed on the effects of constraints in a broader EDAM footprint and schedules on the effects of schedules in different balancing areas and constraints across a wider EDAM footprint that I think helped us inform the, what may be the considerations and the effects considering different design aspects. And today we wanted to focus the discussion entirely on design concept number 3, which is a concept under which congestion revenues are allocated, informed by a common simultaneous feasibility test that incorporates both congestion revenue rights from the CAISO balancing area and firm OAT transmission rights, that is point-to-point and NITS transmission from other EDAM balancing authority areas. And the results of that simultaneous feasibility ultimately inform the magnitude of the congestion revenue allocation and the congestion hedge that may come from that SFT. One of the things that we wanted to, or at least if we're on the objective slide, we wanted to have a robust discussion on this design concept number 3. We encourage you to ask questions. We have a number of slides that kind of introduce the topic, consider a starting point to a potential design, but there are certainly opportunities to consider variations. There are areas that may not be reflected in the slides that we need your input on, that we didn't see when developing the presentation. There are variations to different inputs of how those could be considered, but really the questions are, how do you integrate these CRRs with the eligible OAT transmission rights into a common feasibility test that ultimately results in the congestion revenue allocation design and the congestion revenue entitlements that may emerge from it. So there's a number of opportunities for shaping different questions on the design. What are the inputs? What type of rights are considered? how are CRRs within the CAISO balancing area represented, or uses of the CAISO system represented within that SFT between allocation CRRs, between auction CRRs. We're going to also look to illustrate the different process aspects of the simultaneous feasibility test and how CRRs and outrights would participate within that process, with the starting process being the one that we're familiar with already in how the ISO performs the SFT today under a tiered structure that we'll talk about today. So there's plenty of opportunity to shape the design, shape potential variations of what this could look like, and then discussing some of the trade-offs, the incentives, and additional questions that we may want to raise in vetting and testing the structure that ultimately we come up with. But today is a starting point of a potential design, and through these discussions, we hope to shape different variations and hopefully settle on a more solid structure with your input. Okay, before we jump on into some of the substance, I see there's a question, looks like, from Michelle Keto.
Yes. If we could please unmute Michelle.
Hey, this is Michelle. So I noticed that we're not discussing design concept 2, and I know folks weren't in favor of that, but I did read Department of Market Monitoring's comments on that, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts in response to those comments. And I have one more issue to raise.
I don't frankly remember the comments from the DMM on that concept at this point. I think there's opportunity to consider concept number 2 in future meetings, but today we wanted to focus in on concept number 3 because it's the one where I think most of the stakeholders gravitated towards. We're not taking concept number 2 off the table, but that can come up in upcoming discussions.
Okay, and then my second question is with regard to timing. So I read DC Energy's comments where they said they didn't think that this would be implementable until 2030. Is that your thoughts about timing, or do you have a better sense?
No, I mean, our intent is to develop a design that we can implement ideally by 2028, by the next tranche of EDAM entities that join in the fall of 2028.
Okay.
You know,
Great,
station
thank
timing
you.
will depend upon the structure, but that's our goal.
Okay, thank you.
And we did also get a hand raised from Justin Cockrell. We could
Go ahead,
please unmute Justin.
Yeah, hi. Michelle, thank you for asking that question because I was going to ask it as well. Just to be clear, I'm not advocating that design concept 3 be delayed until 2030. It was just my concern that it was the plan because of comments that were made that, oh, you know, we're not going to make a major change until after NV Energy is able to go live in EDAM. So I'm glad to hear that you are considering doing a major change. You know, design concept 3 is quite honestly a major change. You know, while entities like them are in the implementation process.
Thank you, Justin. Yeah, the intent through these discussions will be, you know, can we implement, let's design it, can we implement it? Are there areas where things could be simplified to enable quicker implementation? But we first wanted to get through this discussion of, you know, let's see what makes sense from a structural perspective of a design that incorporates a common SFT with CRRs and out transmission rights. Once we have that structure more defined, I think we can look for opportunities to simplify if necessary. But our goal is, with any of these designs, can we implement this by the fall of 2028?
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Okay, and just to finish out here again, I encourage you all. I know it's a little bit difficult in a virtual meeting and with a large number of stakeholders, but certainly encourage you to share your perspectives as we go throughout. You don't have to wait for the comments. We certainly appreciate any insights based on what you hear. Are there areas that are not reflected that need to be considered in today's presentations? Are there variations to a number of these concepts, or how certain rights are modeled, how CRRs are represented in the process, feel free to brainstorm out loud with us and suggest variations or different aspects to be considered. I will pause certainly at different areas and pause and pose questions to stimulate some discussion from stakeholders, and certainly appreciate you jumping on if you're comfortable. So if we go to the next slide, let's start with just some of the concept basics on congestion revenue allocation for CRRs and boat rights that are considered through a common simultaneous feasibility test. The goal is to, or the idea of this conceptual design is to establish congestion revenue entitlements, particularly in the day-ahead market, for those congestion revenue rights and firm boat rights that are eligible, that provides those entitlements based on the effectiveness of those rights, those source and sink combinations on constraints across now a broader EDAM footprint. The CRRs and the eligible OAT transmission rights would be evaluated together within a common simultaneous feasibility test, and that feasibility test, similar to its function today, would identify the magnitude of the congestion revenue entitlement, again, in relation to the impact of those rights on the different constraints that are modeled within the SFT and the feasibility ultimately that comes out from that test. I think additionally, day-ahead congestion revenues that may be in excess of those that are needed to be allocated to CRRs and eligible OAT transmission rights. Any of those revenues in excess would be allocated also to the entity based on the location of the constraints. And then in the real-time market, the congestion revenues would be allocated to the EDAM entities and the EIM balancing areas based on the location of the transmission constraint. So the SFT process is really looking at the day-ahead market congestion revenue allocation, and then we will pose this question at the end as well, but in the real time, does it make sense to allocate these congestion revenues in real time to the balancing areas where the constraint is located, consistent with that design today? And I see we have a question, so let's go to that.
If we could please unmute Michelle Keto, please.
Yeah, so sorry, this is not my area of expertise, but maybe you could just help me understand sort of a broader concept, and that is parallel flows. Is it that you're going to allocate the entitlements of parallel flows if they're feasible, or are you going to just assume, I mean, like, for example, I see price separation in California in the spring. That's due to the, the solar we have in the south moving north to load and possibly moving out of the BAA. So, I mean, in some ways it's fully subscribed, but are you going to be saying if parallel flows are feasible, they have entitlements to our system? That doesn't seem right to me. So maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're doing.
Yeah, good question, and I think we'll get to some of this a little bit later as well, but I'll give it a shot, and then James or George, feel free to jump in. But the idea of considering a simultaneous feasibility test across a broader EDAM footprint is that it's going to also account for and capture the loop flow effects across the wider EDAM footprint based on the CRRs and the OAT rights that are considered. And based on those loop flow effects and the physical capabilities of the grid, it's going to establish what is feasible to flow, what are those entitlements to congestion revenues, considering the broader constraints across the EDAM footprint. So yes, it could provide entitlements for rights that consider that those rights can flow, even if they have a loop flow effect on the wider EDAM footprint. But the feasibility test is going to identify are those rights feasible to flow, considering those loop flow effects on each other's systems. And so transmission rights in one balancing area that are feasible, if they have loop flow effects on another system, they would also still receive congestion revenues and and vice versa as well for CRRs. But
James,
James,
so I guess I'm
feel
just
free.
concerned. I guess I just am concerned about embedding the loop flow effects when, like, for example, later on, you sort of say you're going to consider the CRR allocations only, but it almost seems like all the resources and all the load in California should be considered, right? Because we built the transmission system to deliver for resource adequacy purposes, all of the resources to all of the load. So just considering the CRR seems like you leave too much space available for external entities. I won't belabor this point, but I will raise it later. But it does seem problematic to me. I think hopefully I'm missing something.
No, and that's a good question. And I think when we get to that slide, we pose the question, when considering these rights in a common SFD, should there be some other, for representing at least the CAISO balancing area, should there be other consideration beyond just the allocation CRRs? And how does that fare to the consideration of long-term firm rights, point-to-point and NITs, customers from the other balancing areas? And I think
yeah, and it doesn't seem like allocated CRRs is going to be sufficient. Really, it's all the resources in CAISO and all of the load in CAISO. But I'm not an expert on this.
We'll get to that. Yeah,
follow up later.
Good.
Thanks.
Yeah, good question.
Next in the queue, we have a question from Todd Ryan.
Thank you, Todd Ryan from Pacific Gas and Electric. Milos, thank you again for presenting this and continuing the conversation. I have a similar concern to Michelle. I think I'm concerned that a common simultaneous feasibility test will allow FTRs or CRRs, whatever, entitlements in one balancing area to be feasible only because of other balancing areas transmission. So I think this could be a workable solution if there were constraints on the amount of loop flow or intertie that were allowed, and therefore the results of the SFT would be the portion of the rights in each balancing area that are feasible because of that balancing area's own transmission. So I'm happy to discuss it further, take any questions or yeah, thanks.
No, good suggestion, Todd, and I think we'll get to that as well in a later slide with the question. But yeah, are there additional constraints beyond the ones that are already considered today in the SFT? Are there additional constraints that should be considered, along your lines, or does does the nature of the SFT itself, which looks at what's feasible across that wider footprint and the duality of the fact that things could be feasible because of those loop flow effects, but it goes both ways. But that's a fair question to ask, and I think we have that posed a little bit later as well. Are there additional limitations or constraints that need to be considered here, again, to make this an equitable SFT that properly considers both CRRs and uses of each other's systems of the CAISO balancing area, along with the OAT rights in the EDAM balancing areas.
Thank you.
But the idea behind, yeah, go ahead.
No, that was it. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Todd.
I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think we can continue.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide and just continuing to frame the concept, and then we'll get into some of the details. But out of this SFT, and again, keep in mind we've heard some of these questions of are there additional constraints that are needed? Are the CRRs sufficient to represent the uses of the CAISO system? With the OAT rights, we'll get to that later. But assume that we come out to a design that we feel comfortable represents the uses of each other's of the relevant systems within the balancing areas, that represents those balancing areas appropriately in the SFT. What are the resulting congestion? What do the resulting congestion revenue entitlements confer coming out of that simultaneous feasibility test? And as we've talked about, the simultaneous feasibility test would identify those resulting congestion revenue entitlements after considering the CRRs and the OAT rights, and those revenue entitlements would confer the ability to hedge against day-ahead congestion costs by establishing those congestion revenues and then allocating them to provide a level of congestion hedge. It may not be a perfect congestion hedge. It may be something less, depending as you'll see as we walk through the process, and as you're considering the feasibility of all of those rights and uses. But it nevertheless confers an entitlement that provides a congestion hedge. The congestion revenue entitlement would confer a payment based on, again, the effectiveness of those source and sinks associated with the inputs on model constraints. But the entitlement could also confer, in certain instances, an obligation under some of the conditions to the extent that power flows opposite to the model congestion direction, where the source price may be higher than the sink or the delivery price. So it can confer congestion revenue payments, which is the most prevalent occurrence that you would expect, but there could be instances where there could be also a potential charge that results out of this entitlement, and that offsets over a period of time. But as you'll see a little bit later, this design is not dependent from a market operator perspective for settlement on schedules. It's more of an entitlement associated with the transmission rights and expected uses of the system that confers either a payment most of the time, but in some instances, depending on the direction of congestion, it could also potentially result in a charge. And there's room again here to consider, and is this the appropriate entitlement that it works both ways, or in one direction? We think that this is the most equitable approach, similar to the payment and the charge risk associated with CRRs, but nevertheless, certainly there's some room here to consider questions and variations. Go to the next slide. So starting with, not everybody in the discussion may be familiar with the SFT. Those that are not necessarily participating in CAISO CRR processes, they may not be familiar with the SFT. We've spent some time in prior discussions talking about what is the SFT and what is its role and its function. So I'll spend a little bit of time here just covering that and then talking about what are some of the inputs into that SFT. What are all the different things that are considered when evaluating simultaneous feasibility under the test that we run today. But the SFT, in short, is a power flow analysis really that assesses the feasibility of simultaneous flows associated with transmission rights within the capabilities of the entire physical grid. Can all of those rights and all of those uses that you represent in the SFT through that power flow analysis, can they fit within the physical capabilities of the grid that you're modeling? In this case, we would be considering the SFT, not just within the CAISO balancing area, but now across the broader EDAM footprint. Can the different inputs, the CRRs and the OAT rights, can they fit within the physical capabilities of that broader footprint-wide transmission grid? And the SFT process then adjusts those rights, those inputs, those CRRs, those OAT rights. It would adjust them to the extent that they're not all feasible. It would adjust them to fit the physical capabilities of the grid, which would then result in those congestion revenue entitlements. And in later aspects of the presentation, we'll walk through how the SFT does the adjustment, how it does the haircutting, what's the methodology, and illustrate that through an example of what that would look like once you incorporate both CRRs and OAT rights. The primary function of the SFT and the... Yeah, go ahead, James.
Based on some of the questions I heard, I just want to make sure everybody understands that this common SFT is limiting the financial entitlements. It doesn't limit your ability to bid in and use the transmission. It is your ability to get financial entitlements to hedge against your participation in the market.
Thank you, James. Yeah. And we'll get to some of that as well when we talk about the representation of OAT rights and what modeling of OAT rights within within this context means. It doesn't mean a conversion and losing the physical rights, but I see in response to your comment, there's a question. Let's see.
If we could please unmute Michelle Keto.
Yeah, this is Michelle. I just wanted to respond to James. So, but does that mean, for example, that we can't get a hedge across path 15 because we're allowing loop flow on it? So if there's 1,300 megawatts on a 4,000 megawatt transmission line, that means that California can't hedge across that, even though we built the transmission system?
So Michelle, we kind of do that today.
Yeah, I got it, but is it right?
That's, in my opinion, yes, because we are trying to ensure that any transmission or impacts on each other ensures that we're within the transmission limits and constraint. And so therefore, any impact or contribution externally and internally should limit what is the overall hedge we should get.
But don't Seams agreements often require you to pay for the transmission that you're using on other people's system?
George doesn't
So
have power. So
I'm trying to think of the one. Sorry, someone answer from the room.
No, go ahead, James. Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, HBAA is going to pay for their use of the transmission, and the transmission customers who are exercising those rights in the market will either buy that transmission ahead of time or in the ISO will pay for it through the TAC charge. So yes, it still has that purchase of the transmission. So I'm not sure
But
if I'm answering your question,
is loop
Michelle.
flow paid for? So if somebody's trying to move power from Nevada to up and they think they're scheduling on a transmission path outside of California, but in fact it flows over California's BAA, do they pay for it?
Today we don't charge them, no.
And are you trying to embed that in your current system, or are we moving away from that?
So from if that BA, if Nevada and their loop flow is in the market today, it is incorporated in the market solution, and you do have contributions of those constraints or that schedule on the constraints both within that BAA and across the whole footprint. So if Nevada is in the market, the answer is it is incorporated. If Nevada is not in the EDAM market, we are using proxies to determine what the loop flow is today in order to ensure we don't oversubscribe on our transmission.
Okay, I'm just concerned that we're just embedding usage rather than trying to incorporate usage of other BAA's transmission. So anyway, okay,
Understood.
thanks.
It's like we have no more hands, so I think we can continue on.
And thanks, James, and thanks, Michelle, for those questions. And so just continuing on with this slide, let me just finish this slide, and then I think we can go to the questions. But just to finish off this slide, within the context of establishing a congestion revenue allocation design, the primary purpose of the SFT really is to support revenue adequacy, because it's looking at, what is the feasible set of uses of the system across the wider market footprint in order to provide an effective congestion hedge that is ultimately revenue adequate that you can pay out. So seeks to ensure that congestion revenues collected can ultimately cover those financial payouts based on what is feasible to flow. And as we said before, the SFT in the context of loop flow effects, by modeling that wider EDAM footprint, it can capture those loop flow effects across the model transmission systems, across that wider EDAM footprint. There may need to be some assumptions about loop flow effects across other systems that are outside of that market footprint, but within the market footprint, it's able to capture those loop flow effects because it's looking at feasibility across that interconnected system without necessarily looking at, boundaries, similar to how the market uses the entire transmission grid across the market footprint to dispatch generation for everybody's benefit, finds the most efficient solution, considering, as James said, the loop flow effects across each other system. Can those rights flow across that wider grid and provide benefit based on those, based on the dispatch solution? But let's see. There's a couple more questions on this slide. I think maybe in response to the continued discussion with James. But let's go to questions.
First, we have Jordan Miner.
Hi, Jordan Miner, CPUC Energy Division. Yeah, I'm following up on the response from James Lin. When we say incorporated into the market solution, is this to say that loop flows from EDAM entities will be paying for the loop flows that they're causing? Yes or no?
What it means is when the market optimizes the schedules, it will take into consideration that schedule's impact on various constraints, whatever has that constraint has contributions from that schedule, and it'll incorporate the congestion in the LMP of that schedule. So the answer is yes.
Thank you. And then the follow-up question, and I can save this for the Steams workshop, but we will not be able to incorporate loop flows caused by non-EDAM entities. So non-EDAM entities will still be able to use our system for free, right?
I think within the SFT, similar to today, I think we would make some assumptions about what those loop flow effects would be, so that the SFT does account for some level of loop flow effect, some unscheduled flow effect. Is that right?
That's correct.
Within the broader footprint, you'll be able to more accurately capture those loop flow effects because you're looking at a common interconnected system and the flows across from it. But for outside the footprint, I think you would just have to, you would, based on the modeling that we have of WEC-wide, I think it would look to make some assumptions about those unscheduled loop flow effects. So you wouldn't assume there's none, but you would make some assumptions about those.
But from a market perspective, also, we do not have the ability to see what the other market is dispatching. So we have to use our entitlement limits to manage our market. So if the dispatch of the other market has impacts on the overall congestion of their market, it doesn't impact us, and ours doesn't impact them at the moment. But that is a discussion for Steams.
And then one final question. Does KISO have a sense, in terms of the loop flows, how much are being caused by prospective EDAM entities and how much the loop flows are being caused by non-EDAM entities? Like, are we able to split the loop flow out by EDAM align versus Marcus Plus align?
Go ahead.
Yeah, we don't have that metric, Jordan, and I would say it's not trivial because there are many interplays across the different rights or schedules. Some of them may be offsetting each other, some of them may be compounded. So it's not just an algebraic equation to easily derive.
Okay, thank you, Guillermo.
Let's go to Justin.
Next, can we go to Justin Cockrell, please?
Yeah, thank you. Jordan and Michelle actually covered a lot of what I wanted to say, and I share similar concerns. I guess I would just, to not end up repeating them, I guess I would just say that it is very important to figure out the amount of loop flow from other BAAs compared to those joining EDAM. And maybe this is slightly out of scope, but one thing that we should really be considering is something where there would be an established firm flow entitlements on the seams with other BAAs, where you wouldn't want to build in a free pass for them and say, oh, okay, you can absolutely use the maximum amounts you've ever been using, but you set an amount and you say, all right, well, this is kind of a reasonable amount. We understand the physics of it. There's going to be some unscheduled loop flow, but then there's a mechanism for there to be a financial payment from those other entities. That would really help with the missing money issue that will continue even after NV Energy and other entities are integrated into EDAM.
Thanks, Justin. Are you suggesting above and you mean in the context of congestion revenue allocation, or are you saying that there should be payments for transmission usage independent of congestion revenue? And how do you account for the congestion revenue allocation? Because, as James said, the market is optimizing the entire grid for everybody's benefit through the dispatch of generation. What we're trying to do here with congestion revenue allocation is what should be the congestion revenue allocation without, putting any kind of limits on the optimization itself. But just to get a clarification, are you suggesting there should be? Go ahead.
What I'm suggesting is there should be you can't allocate what you don't collect. So what I'm suggesting is that there should be a congestion revenue collection from entities that are not joining, that are either haven't joined yet or are in Arizona, don't plan to join, and
I see.
they have those parallel flows. There should be a firm flow entitlement type system where if you cause a certain amount of flow, well, then over and above that, you're going to pay. And then that can be allocated on, maybe to the rights holders on the financial rights holders on the constraints where that congestion occurs, things like that.
I see. So you're looking at it more in the context of non-market areas, balancing areas, and the effect that they have on the market area in terms of loop flow and some mechanism. Is there some mechanism there that can also collect revenues associated with those loop flow effects, maybe establishing, as you said, some entitlements, but whatever comes from that helps fund also these congestion entitlements, CRRs, and or the entitlements associated with OG rights.
Right.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this time.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. So continuing in the theme of just, again, familiarizing ourselves in what the inputs are into the SFT, and really where the focus of some of the discussions is. So there's a number of inputs that go into the SFT. We've looked to categorize these as best as we could here, but one is we have the transmission model of the WEC, which also includes the EDAM balancing areas in particular. And that transmission model of the WEC is kind of the baseline input into the SFT. Then we have a set of contingencies and constraints that are modeled within that SFT. In this context, it would be for the CAISO balancing area and the other EDAM balancing area. So footprint-wide, EDAM footprint-wide set of constraints that would be now incorporated in that SFT as you expand that SFT now across the EDAM footprint. Another set of inputs is just the model transmission elements and flow gates, transmission limits, to the extent that there are any known outages or, those will be captured in the relevant time frame within the SFT. But you want to have an accurate representation of the transmission availability and the flow gate availability within that wider EDAM footprint that you're testing within the SFT. Then is what we, I think, talked about here just a couple of minutes ago, but it's those loop flow assumptions, WEC wide, and I think with the recent CRR enhancements, approvals that we have, there's an opportunity to have better informed loop flow assumptions across the wider West, which would feed into those SFT assumptions. So as we said, within the EDAM footprint, the market is going to be able to, or the SFT is going to be able to capture those loop flow effects. But it's important as well to have those loop flow assumptions associated with other non-market balancing areas so that you have as accurate of a model as possible. Then we have some of the more tangible inputs of the legacy transmission rights, the ETC TORs, and those would be for the CAISO balancing area, which we incorporate today, but also there's legacy transmission rights and ownership rights in the other EDAM balancing areas. The magnitude of it varies, it's smaller, but nevertheless, there are legacy rights that are respected through the EDAM design within the other EDAM areas that would also be captured as a baseline, as a fixed input into the SFT, just like we do that today for the CAISO balancing area. And then the last kind of component, which is really subject of the meshing and the shaping that we're trying to do here through these discussions, is including the appropriate CRRs and OAT rights that are captured within this common simultaneous feasibility test. And that's really the key subject of the discussion is what are those CRRs and what are those OAT rights that are reflected within the SFT. All of these inputs then come together and are input into the software model that ultimately performs the SFT through the different iterations that we'll talk a little bit later about, and the results ultimately are the resulting entitlements, what is feasible based on all of these inputs, what is feasible to flow across that wider footprint, considering the constraints, the loop flow effects, the transmission elements, the legacy rights, and the included or nominated congestion revenue rights and OAT rights. So we have a question. Let's go to Todd.
Yeah, can we please unmute Todd Ryan, please?
Todd Ryan from Pacific Gas and Electric. Hey, Milos, I appreciate the like all the thoroughness of this presentation so far, and it occurred to me while writing our comments for the last round that I don't think we've been seen any recent loop flow data, and I'm wondering if you could invite the RC West representatives to come present on historic loop flows in the WEC. I know that Oasis has a table that includes data for loop flow in California, but it's always a zero value. And I'm sure that now that the RC West has had a number of years operating for a majority of the EDAM footprint, if not that plus, that they might have some insights in terms of historical loop flows. Is that something you think that might be possible?
Well, let me test with Guillermo. Guillermo, go ahead, share your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's important to have the context of what loop flows we are talking about. As you may know, for the California balancing area, I believe we have 6 defined official paths where we track parallel flows, and these are typically on the main interfaces. I believe the discussion we're having here for this SFT is beyond these defined paths. I think we're more talking about every internal transmission constraint in the CAISO. That is the piece of information that is not really available. Yes, there are specific defined paths where the loop flows are tracked properly because we have indeed a series of steps, operationally speaking, to manage those loop flows in our system when they show up. But this discussion is beyond these 6 identified paths. I think we're talking here about every single constraint in the CAISO system.
I understood that we might, that they're different sets and they're not necessarily identical, but it would be I think, helpful to understand where we've been operating for the last few years, and also understanding that EDAM is going to change flows and that those may not continue. It just might be helpful context, especially given the fact that there's no publicly available data on the CAISO website for which we can understand the current loop flow levels. So I don't mind if you provide those data to us publicly, or whether you have it presented, but I think it would be very helpful to have a discussion publicly about historic loop flows.
Okay, yeah, let us take that back and see, where we could find the information, how feasible it is to get it, but good suggestion, and I think we can take that back. Thank you, Todd.
I'm not seeing any other questions, so we can continue on.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. And this is just, again, to help folks visualize what we mean when we talk about an SFT and the SFT identifying results, where there may be infeasibilities, and potentially that drives any kind of adjustments that may need to be made within the inputs to make sure that, to see what is feasible, how much is feasible if the amount that we originally input is not. But, typical inputs, you can see there, these are just some screenshots, but just some typical inputs associated with the transmission, source and sink information, and then the typical outputs, that we receive once we run that SFT. And we have Philip here online who performs that SFT. He's our resident expert. The typical inputs will identify, the type of constraint or the nature of the constraint that may be creating the infeasibility, and the magnitude of it, and then that drives potential adjustments to the inputs in order to see what is feasible in order to not violate that particular constraint. Again, this is just some visual, again, to help folks think through and visualize what we mean when we say an SFT and the different types of information, and how granular the SFT can identify the constraints that may be causing an infeasibility that ultimately may necessitate potential adjustments or reductions in the inputs to again fit everything within the physical limits of the grid. And I see, let's take a question here as well.
Looks like Steve Keen has his hand up. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, hi, Steve Keen from Edison. On this slide, is it possible you have the inputs and the output table reversed? It just looks like the table on the left would be the outputs coming out of it, since that shows the nominated megawatts and the allocated megawatts, and the table on the right seems to show the transmission constraints.
I can jump in on that one.
Yeah, go ahead, Philip, go ahead.
Hey, yeah, this is Philip Rothman with the CR team here at CAISO. Yeah, I guess you're right. The one on the left is kind of a combination of input and output. The main input that participants submit are the nominations into the process. So the screenshot on the left has showing the inputs that would be submitted, the nominated megawatt, and it does have as well the result of the SFT, which would be the allocated megawatts for each of those nominations. The screenshot on the right are the binding constraint set. So that would be an output of the process indicating which of the modeled constraints were limiting the result.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Let's go to the next slide. And then again, try following through on the concept of performance of the SFT with the different inputs, along the lines of what we've talked about to date on the SFT, is that there will be an annual and a monthly SFT, consistent with the timelines of how we perform the SFT today, at least within the CAISO balancing area. But these inputs would feed into the annual SFT that would establish those entitlements to congestion revenues based on the inputs, the CRRs and the OAT rights. And then there will also be a performance closer in time with some adjusted inputs, Closer in time, you're going to have better information on transmission outages, for example. That would be added or modified input, but in the monthly process, you would then also run a monthly SFT that would establish or could establish incremental entitlements to what you may have already identified in the annual SFT process. So similar to today, the results of the annual SFT and the entitlements that emerge from the annual SFT feed as a static input into the monthly process, into the monthly SFT, where you, as you'll see a little bit later, where you model kind of now, you adjust the inputs with better information, you make more of the system available, and it may lead to additional incremental entitlements on top of the ones that were already provided in the annual process or through the annual SFT. Let's go to the next slide. So this next section is going to talk about the nomination process or inclusion of CRRs and the submission of eligible firm out transmission rights. We'll take it step by step. We'll talk a bit about out rights. What should be the eligible out rights considered within this process, and then we'll do the same for CRRs. What should be the eligible CRRs that are incorporated within this common SFT process, and asking questions along the way. Are those the appropriate inputs? Are there additional inputs that need to be considered that maybe have not been captured in the slides? But this is really where we want to stimulate discussion and get some input. The first slide that I'll start here is just a graphic representation that I think will go, if we go to actually to the next slide. So we'll start here, but the SFT, as we talked about, will include CRRs as well as eligible out transmission rights. I think the starting point for discussion is certainly you want to include, from a CRR perspective, you certainly want to include the allocated CRRs, or that are the CRRs that are established through the allocation process for the load serving entities within that SFT. I think the question, as you will get later in the CRR section, is are there other or additional inputs representing the CAISO balancing area uses? For example, some aspects or some assumptions about maybe auction CRRs or anything else that maybe we haven't captured that more equitably represents and is comparable to what you would consider from the out rights within that process. And then similarly, from the EDAM balancing area side, what are those eligible out rights that are considered within that common SFT process? You certainly want to incorporate firm out rights, point to point and NITs, as you'll see a little bit later, but are there other representation or different representations of rights that should be considered as well? And there's some coordination here that may be needed from the EDAM entity working with its transmission customers ultimately and transmission providers to incorporate and identify those eligible rights. And then another set of inputs is the legacy transmission rights, the ETC TORs that exist across the wider EDAM footprint that would also be incorporated and reflected as a static input into that common SFT. Those legacy rights, those are ETC TORs for the EDAM balancing areas. Those are legacy transmission contracts, pre-open access transmission tariffs that they may have on their systems that will be incorporated here and have unique terms and conditions that historically, and both within the EDAM design, but also within the CAISO SFT processes, those legacy rights are the primary one or the first ones that are incorporated and act as a static input within that SFT. So we'll walk through each one of these and really pause and really stimulate discussion on are there additional inputs or different inputs that should be considered? And again, considering the equity of representation of the out rights and ultimately the CRRs within the CAISO balancing area. We see Stephen has a question. Let's pause here.
Yeah, can we please unmute Steve?
Hi, Steve Dean from Edison. Kind of getting at that equity question, and maybe you're going to discuss this later, and that's fine, but in the CAISO, you're talking about the allocation, which I believe in the annual allocation is like up to 65%. But then there's
Yes.
also the, what do they call it? Just, the amount that they don't do I can't remember the specific name for it right now, but the basically the write down amount that they do. Are you going to
Yeah.
talk about, would there have to be similar type of rules for the oat transmission stuff too? Would they
Yeah,
be forced
and we'll
to have?
get to that. That's right, and I think that we'll get to that a little bit later once we talk about performing the SFT itself. But you're referring, I think, primarily to the global derate factor that within the annual process, we really consider we only consider 65% of the transmission capacity when evaluating this SFT to account for some of the uncertainty associated with outages, loop flows, topology changes, and then you make more available in the monthly process once you have better information, you have updated inputs on outages, et cetera. Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit later, and I think we'll pose the question, because now you're going to be modeling the wider EDAM footprint, you also, I think we have some ability to better model the loop flow effects from the wider WEC, and by modeling the wider EDAM footprint, you're gonna model those loop flow effects. Does that raise the possibility that maybe you can adjust that global derate factor upwards somewhat in the annual process? Does that make sense, or do you stay, with that 65%? But the idea is all of these inputs are considered within the same SFT, and so the question for that same SFT is, should that global derate factor, to what extent should that 65% global derate factor apply? Should it be adjusted or not? But yeah, the idea is you apply that same global derate factor in the common SFT that includes both CRRs and OAT rights, and that will be the question is, does that need to be adjusted in some way or not?
Okay, thank you.
Let's go to Todd.
Yeah, can we please unmute Todd next?
Hey, Milos, Todd Ryan, Pacific Gas and Electric. I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but the question of like equity between the types of rights that are put into their inputs into the SFT are really tricky because there could be incentives to push your nominations different ways. That if this is one big SFT, if there are constraints for intertie flow between the balancing areas, I believe some of those incentives are eliminated because the nominations in one balancing area won't affect other balancing areas. And I believe that just leaves, if we're using it to help guide each balancing area in terms of what financial tools they can use to allocate their congestion, then the incentive is just to put in accurate information. And so some of this question of equity is eliminated if there are constraints on how balancing areas can interact.
Okay.
Something to think about.
No, good suggestion, Doc. Yeah, good thought. And let's come back to that when we talk about the OAT rights in particular. And let's see what the incentives may be based on what's eligible and based on how those transmission rights arise. To what extent is there an incentive to create more ATC? To what extent is there to tinker with the rights? And to what extent is there the ability to actually do that? Let's talk through that and would appreciate you coming back at that point as well. And let's talk through that thought on the OAT rights.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah. Let's go to the next slide. So on this slide, we will be coming back to this slide periodically. I think this is just representing a starting point. What goes into the common SFT? And I think this is where we want to come back and tinker with this to the extent necessary. But, as a starting point, we certainly want to incorporate, as we talked about, legacy rights. Those are the ETC TORs, free OAT transmission rights across the wider EDAM footprint. You certainly want to include the nominated CRRs within the allocation process. Those are CRRs that are allocated first before you get to the auction, that are allocated to load serving entities within the CAISO balancing area because, as somebody noted earlier, they bear the cost and they're responsible for the cost of the system. They bear it on a load basis, and therefore they get an allocation of these rights subject to the SFT. They nominate the rights they go through the SFT, and then the SFT identifies ultimately what they receive. But that allocation happens first before you get into any kind of auction. And then certainly we want to define what are those eligible firm out rights that feed into that common SFT, and then you have those common SFT results. The thought is that you know, and part of the question is for us as well is, well, after you've taken those inputs and you've nominated and you've represented the CRRs, is there another SFT for auction CRRs? Because that happens after you've identified what can you allocate through the CRR process. But I think the question is, should there also be some assumptions potentially on other uses of the system that should be captured within that common SFT? Should there be some assumptions about auction CRRs, for example, within the SFT for the CAISO balancing area? Or should there be other assumptions that more reflect the uses of the CAISO grid within that representation in the SFT beyond the CRRs that emerge from the allocation process? So we'll be coming back to this slide periodically here to see how should this be adjusted, if adjusted at all, based on what are those appropriate inputs that feed into the common SFT, and how does this relate then also to the auction process that we have for auction CRRs within the CAISO balancing area. So we have let's pause for a question here. I think we see Michelle looks like has a question.
Yes. Can we please unmute Michelle Keto?
Yeah, Michelle Keto, can you explain to me how you're going to, I mean, let's say that the submitted eligible firm outrights are the ones that that impose the loop flow. Is loop flow sort of an exogenous variable that you put in, or is it part of the SFT model itself?
Yeah, good question. I'll start, and then George or James, feel free to jump in and or Philip and you know, add more color to it. But once you incorporate the out rights in the common SFT along with CRRs, the SFT itself will identify and consider those effects within the SFT. You don't have to make additional loop flow inputs within that common SFT across the EDAM footprint, but based on the shift factor effects of the different source and sink rights on the different constraints, the market will incorporate, or at least the SFT will consider those loop flow effects. And are these rights, all of these rights, feasible, considering that full interconnected grid and the effects that those rights have on the different constraints that are modeled within the SFT? So you don't have to input any additional assumptions about loop flows within that footprint that you're evaluating. But George or Philip or James, feel free to elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, this is Phil. I can maybe add a little to that too. So as far as accounting for loop flows, I mean, what Milos said is correct in that the flows that currently would be considered unaccounted for from the entities that in the future would be, you know, we would have the visibility once they're in EDAM. I think those solve part of that problem, but there may still be, you know, unaccounted for flows from other entities that we can have some ways to account for within the common SFT. So we mentioned in the CR BPM, there's basically two ways we can do that, either specifically modeling those flows as injections and withdrawals to see what capacity those flows take up within the transmission system, or the other method, which is what we do today, is more estimating what those loop flow impacts would be on a constraint by constraint basis and adjust the limits of those constraints accordingly to reduce the capacity that's expected to be taken up from loop flows. So we could continue to fine tune that, you know, as more entities join EDAM and those sort of flows change from being unaccounted for to visible to us.
But if you're adjusting constraints, it's based on the loop flow that exists, but now you're moving them into the model itself. How do you know how much to move into the model versus how much to exogenously assume?
My initial thought there is the nominations that represent the oat rights within the common SFT would represent those that are moving into the model, if you would. And then, we would need to sort of take a look after those flows are incorporated to get a feel for, maybe what's still unaccounted for.
And then they put that in as well. Okay. Okay. Thanks. And then also, if you have to, like, let's say the SFT is binding, and so you have to reduce it, is there an order of operation? So do you say legacy rights first, nominated CRR second, and then oat rights no, if you don't have sufficient room on, let's say, our backbone transmission system?
We'll get into that with the future slides that cover how the curtailment or haircutting occurs. As Milos alluded to, the legacy rights are sort of treated separately. They're put in as more of like a fixed input that are not really haircut. But then the oat rights and the CRR nominations would both be evaluated under a weighted least squares methodology, which, as I mentioned, we'll walk through in a little bit.
But if it's, let's say the constraint is on the CAISO system, you'd still use that methodology?
We would still use that methodology, but one of the main considerations for that methodology, or that's in the calculation of that methodology, is the shift factor to the binding constraint. So the nominations, whether they be within CAISO as a CRR nomination or an oat right, a nomination representing an oat right, it would really just depend on the sensitivity of those nomination paths to the constraint in question.
So it's not as if California sort of gets a legacy right to its existing system under this methodology, similar to the ETCs and TORs.
Yeah, that would not be our starting point here. I guess folks can raise that. We can consider the merits of that, but the thought was a starting point, at least for consideration, is applying that same method of effectiveness of those rights on constraints. And the further you are, the less effective you are on them. But yeah, we can certainly raise that, and we can have a discussion and see how folks feel about a different methodology.
Okay, I mean, if we're just thinking about equity, I'm sorry, it just seems like it just seems problematic if it's equity that we're after here. Okay, thanks.
I believe George Angelides wanted to jump in, so let me unmute him. George, you're now unmuted.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Just a clarification so that we have those terms right in our discussion. Loop flow and parallel flow, these are two different things, okay? The parallel flow is the impact of rights in a balancing authority area, the impact that they have on other balancing authority areas in the market. So for example, Pacific Corp water rights, they have a parallel flow on ISO network, and similarly CRR nominations have parallel flows on Pacific Corp network. The loop flow that we're talking about is coming from external transactions that are modeled balancing authority. And we model this so that we make sure we account for the loop flow through the market
I'm sorry, I can't hear George.
CRR.
George, we're
Can you hear
losing
me?
you a bit. You're coming in and out. That sounds better. Try again.
Yeah, so I think I explained the parallel flow. I was explaining the loop flow that is caused by external transactions outside of the market footprint. So those two are separate, and the loop flow is modeled as a fixed impact in the SFT by modeling estimates of external transactions in balancing authority areas outside of the market footprint, whereas the parallel flow is optimized in the SFT, making sure that the CRR nominations and the OAT rights of all the balancing authority areas in the market footprint, they are adjusted evenly and based on the efficiency with the shift factors constraints so that you have an outcome where you don't have violations of these constraints. And the equity part that came into question here is coming down because we are considering all these instruments, namely the CRR nominations and the OAT rights that compete for transmission on the market footprint. We consider them at the same priority. So they all get the same least squares adjustment to fit the capability of the network that is released in the specific SFT tier.
Right, but isn't it the case that what was previously loop flow becomes parallel flow as you move them into the model? I guess that's my point.
Well, if a balancing authority area that is not part of the market footprint joins, let's say, EDAM and becomes now a part of the market footprint, what was parallel flow because of transactions modeled in that balancing authority area now does become parallel flow for balancing authority areas outside of that BAA, but still within the market footprint. So yes, as the market footprint expands, this changes gradually.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Next, we have a question from Alan Meck.
Hi, Alan Meck, PG&E. I've been thinking about, I want to go back to the question of what set of CRRs to include in the model. And it seems like, so CAISO's positing that we should include allocated CRRs, and maybe the counter proposal is that we should include auctioned CRRs. I'm wondering, though, if neither of those is the right pool of rights to include, because the nominated CRRs are restricted. The entities bidding in for allocation of CRRs are restricted in what we can bid because we're potentially subject to disallowances and error when we go to file for recovery. And so the allocated pool of CRRs, what I'm trying to impress is artificially constrained by non-market driven factors that don't have to do with really the power flow of the system. And then on the other side, the auctioned CRRs, we don't know, but we kind of suspect that maybe there are some entities putting a lot of bids into the auction CRR process that are designed to create counterflow in order to enable, in order to unlock maybe some of the more valuable CRRs to get allocated into the auction process, or to be released in the auction process, I should say. And so I'm not sure if I can trust the pool of auction CRRs either. Like the nominations that go into both of those pools might be subject to distortions.
Yeah, and Alan, we'll get to it here in a couple of slides. I think the challenge, if you don't consider any CRRs or you don't use this common SFT to, at least to represent CRRs, is, common SFT was intended to provide that financial entitlement for CRRs as well. So you would want to have some, at least, relationship between the CRRs, or some inclusion of CRRs within that common SFT process. And then I think it's a question of, do you need to make any adjustments to the constraints or the models, at least to reflect additional uses or different uses of the CAISO system? But I think you still want some CRRs in this common SFT because, that's intended to result in the level of, are all these rights feasible to provide a financial entitlement for both CRRs and OAT rights? But I get your point, and I think the question is beyond nominated CRRs, or are there different adjustments or different inputs maybe that are short of maybe auction CRRs or some combination of the two that should be reflected to better account for the uses of the CAISO system in that common SFT, since the CAISO balancing area doesn't sell physical rights on a forward basis like the OAT rights or like under the OAT parties can get. But that's a fair question. Maybe let's think about that as we go first through the OAT rights and then think about the CRRs and seeing the comparability of what's reflected within that common SFT and how many extraneous factors are considered versus not. But that's a good thought, Alan. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alan. Next in the queue, we have Jordan Miner. Go ahead, Jordan.
And Jordan, we can't hear you.
You can see he's unmuted now.
Jordan Miner, CPUC, NH Division. Just a big clarification question for this conversation. The CRR nomination process limits entities' nominations to the load adjusted metric. I might have that acronym wrong, so correct me if I have it wrong. But the OAT rights, there's no limit how much an entity can get, correct?
Well, there are, I think it comes down to the eligibility of rights, and there are practical limits. And you'll see once we get to it here shortly, there are different types of transmission rights. You have NITS transmission rights that limit, not necessarily how much you can get, but what you would represent in this process is limited by load. And then you have point-to-point rights, which, technically there's no limit that what parties can request, but there's a practical limit in the physical limits of the transmission lines between all the different uses and how much the transmission provider makes available. So there are some inherent limits that I think you're getting at. Can we compare what feeds into the common SFT between the CRRs that are in the allocation process versus the OAT rights? And that's precisely what I think we'll try to do here in the next couple of slides. But there are different limits that apply in terms of OAT rights, and they're practical physical limits. And I think it comes down to the eligibility of transmission rights that you would consider within this process. It's probably not everything, not all the transmission rights they sell, but as you'll see, I think our starting point is with just the long-term firm rights, which are finite, limited by the physical capabilities of the system, limited by NERC standards that dictate how you calculate firm ATC. So there are some limits there. But it's a fair question. I think keep an eye on that as we go through the discussion, and we can I think clarify what the limits are on what the practical limitations are with the rights, with the OAT rights that would be considered.
Okay, thank you. I'll keep thinking about this.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jordan. And I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this time, so I think we can continue on.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. And let's start. So now we start into the fun part, which is, okay, let's talk about, I think what a number of you have been trying to, or raising already. But we'll start with, let's go to the next slide. We'll start with the OAT rights. What are the eligible OAT rights that should be considered within this type of a design of a common SFT that ultimately looks at feasibility of all of these rights and establishes the congestion revenue entitlements? I think as a starting point, and we've talked about this in prior discussions, I think as a starting point, the eligible OAT rights likely should be long-term firm point-to-point and NITS rights. You don't want to consider non-firm rights for a number of different reasons that we can touch on. I think there's discussion we can have. Are there other shorter duration firm rights that should be considered? But I think as your starting point, as a base starting point, certainly your long-term firm point-to-point and NITS transmission rights. And these are transmission rights that have been reserved on the host transmission provider systems on a long-term basis, meaning for 1 year or longer, and likely much longer with renewal rights But, you know, these are long-term rights that are reserved on a 1 year or longer duration basis. And that means that through that reservation process, the transmission provider has determined on their system, it's gone through their ATC evaluation, where they have a finite amount of firm, long-term firm ATC or long-term firm transmission that can be sold. It's usually less than the full capability of the transmission path because of the different margins that the transmission provider accounts for. But the transmission provider has determined that I could grant these rights on a long-term basis on my system from the source to the defined sink. And once these transmission rights are reserved, they contribute to the long-term cost of the system. The transmission customers are paying for transmission to the transmission provider in slightly different ways between these rights, as I'll walk through here. But starting point is long-term firm point-to-point, and its transmission rights should be considered within this process, and certainly not non-firm rights. I think the question is, as you'll see there later, should there be others considered, but at least long-term firm rights are the ones where parties are contributing to the long-term costs of the system. You have long-term firm point-to-point transmission rights, again, 1 year or longer in duration, that are paying for that transmission on a long-term basis, contributing to the cost of the system on a long-term basis, and are paying for those transmission rights whether or not they use them. So you reserve 100 megawatts of point-to-point transmission, you're paying for 100 megawatts whether or not you're using those transmission rights. But you have the physical right to use that transmission system for the duration of your reservation, and that's 1 year or longer. The firm part of these rights is what allows you to, only firm transmission rights are sold on a long-term basis, but the firm part of these rights is that these rights are transmission rights that have a higher priority on the host transmission provider system in terms of transmission curtailments, greater level of certainty, and therefore these are valuable rights that parties look to invest to on a long-term basis because it gives them higher certainty of being able to schedule and use those rights, reduce curtailments on the system, or less susceptible to curtailments because you have to, they have a firm right to use the system. These are physical rights to use the system, as I said, from the defined source to the defined sink. That's static during the reservation period. It has a defined megawatt quantity. And importantly, long-term rights, whether point-to-point or NITS transmission, those are the rights that can drive transmission upgrades on the transmission provider system. Short-term rights, a monthly firm right, for example, doesn't drive transmission upgrades, but it's, once you've identified that you intend to use the system on a long-term basis, that is what drives, to the extent that capacity is not available, that is what drives studies and upgrades, because you're indicating you want to use the system on a long-term basis, and so it's worthwhile to expand the system as opposed to shorter-term duration rights that don't have that same obligation, nor do they drive transmission upgrades. So that's one quality of long-term rights, is they pay for the long-term uses of the system. They can drive transmission upgrades as well, and these are valuable rights that parties have invested to on a long-term basis. Point-to-point rights, as the name implies, source to sink, defined for the reservation period for the megawatt amounts, and they pay for the costs of the system. They pay to the transmission provider. NITS transmission rights, or long-term NITS transmission rights, represent transmission reservations needed for delivery of dedicated or designated network resources to serve native or network load. So long-term NITS or NITS transmission service overall is used to serve load on the host transmission provider, system. They designate resources. That could be an import, or it could be a physical generator, but they designate resources through the OAT process to say this resource is dedicated to serving my load, and the transmission provider then evaluates, is there enough long-term firm ATC from the source to the sink to grant that long-term designation of the network resource. Load serving entities, like I said, use NITS transmission service to deliver resources to load, and they don't pay per reservation. They pay based on the entire load. So as the load consumes energy on the grid, they pay for transmission service basically on use. I think similar to load serving entities within the CAISO that pay for the transmission service based on use. But under the old construct, they dedicate or designate resources to serve that load on a long-term or short-term basis. But on a long-term basis, if you designate a network resource, you could also drive transmission upgrades because you want to deliver a generator on a long-term basis from point A to the load. You've invested into that generator. You could also drive a transmission upgrade to make sure that you have that long-term firm NITS transmission to deliver and support your load. And we'll get into each one of these in subsequent slides. But as we go through the next two slides, keep in mind, should there be this is what we want to stimulate discussion, should there be other types of OAT rights that are eligible for consideration within the SFT beyond the long-term firm OAT rights that contribute to the long-term costs of the system, that drive transmission upgrades, whereas shorter duration rights don't necessarily do that, don't drive those upgrades. Let's go to the next slide. We'll go first with point-to-point rights and how those will be modeled within the system. So point-to-point rights, we talked about that on this previous slide. Just as the name implies, again, from point A to point B, point-to-point transmission rights. They've got a defined source, they've got a defined sink, and have a static amount of megawatts that they've paid for the long-term reservation period of 1 year or longer in duration. How you would model these rights within the common SFT is from the reserved source. So from it could be a generator, if the parties are looking to have point-to-point rights from the generator to an export point, or it could be an import location. That could be the reserved source that we generally see with point-to-point transmission rights, a physical generator within the BA or an import location into the BA. The reserved sink, it's generally for point-to-point rights, predominantly it's an export location because point-to-point rights are primarily utilized to wheel through a transmission provider system or to export from that transmission provider system or from the balancing area. Point-to-point rights, they can, but are seldom used to serve load because of the nuances of how load pays for transmission, right? They pay for transmission based on load, and so you don't necessarily want to reserve additional point-to-point service and have to pay for it on the host system if you're already paying for your service based on load. But it could be, there are some instances where point-to-point service is used to serve load on the system, but the predominant use is to wheel through or to export from that transmission provider system or from the balancing area. And so the reserved sink, generally what you would expect to see is an export location on the system. The source is the import or a generator, and the sink is an export point on the system because you're using point-to-point rights to make sales to deliver generation to other areas that you're exporting or wheeling through that balancing area. And so you would model it based on the reserved sink location within the SFT, which again, largely would expect to be export location, not load, but it could be some nuances and some variations in this. And then the reserve quantity is the megawatt amount of that long-term firm point-to-point reservation that you would model and represent within that simultaneous feasibility test. Let's go to the next slide. So how do you model then NITS, Network Integration Transmission Service? That's what NITS stands for, but that's the other type of transmission rights that are reservable under the open access transmission tariffs. And as I mentioned before, this type of transmission service is exclusively used by load serving entity within an EDAM balancing area, that rely on NITS service to deliver their resources that they've purchased or that they own to get transmission and deliver it to their load. NITS transmission customers, again, the load serving entities can designate network transmission service, can designate these network resources on a long-term basis of 1 year or longer. They have to meet certain requirements under the oath, certain attestation requirements that exist under the oath, and they may vary from transmission provider to transmission provider, but under the pro forma, their attestation requirements that resource that they're looking to designate hasn't been committed for other sales for the designation period, that they have the capability to deliver it to the system if those are external resources and a number of other requirements. But you have to meet certain requirements in order to designate these resources and get that long-term reservation for the designated network resource from the defined source to the defined sink, which is the load point. The important limitation on niche transmission service is that you can only use as much niche transmission service as is your load. You should not be using niche transmission to deliver resources that are not syncing to your load. You should be using point-to-point for that. But you should also not be using more niche transmission service than your load. So, you know, there's an inherent limitation here of the niche transmission that you consider is limited by the load amount. So if you have more designated resources than your network load or than your peak load, you know, what you would represent within this SFT is resources, those designated resources up to your load amount and not above that. In terms of, which I think is similar to, again, once we go to the next few slides and talk about CRRs, but I think it's similar to, in a lot of respects, to CAISO load serving entities within this process where your nominations are limited by a representation of load. And I think similarly here, the niche transmission, the designated resources to the load that you would represent are limited by that load amount. And I think that's part of the questions. Once you get into the details, are you looking at peak load or some kind of historical load on a year-to-year basis? But nevertheless, you're limiting those representations of long-term NITs, right? So those long-term designated resources to your load. In terms of how you would model or represent these NITs transmission reservations within the SFT process is you would look at the reserved source. So it would be the designated network resource, a physical generator within the balancing area, or it could be, you know, a purchase of generation that is imported to your balancing area on a long-term basis. And so a reserved source could be an import location within that EDAM balancing area system. And then the reserved sink would be the load location. And there's different representations of the load at different levels of DLAPs, et cetera. But the idea is your sink is your model load within that SFT. A sink for these rights is not an export point. And then the reserved quantity is the represented quantity of the designated network resource based on that reservation. But all of those representations of designated network resources should not exceed your load or the model load that you're incorporating or limiting here for NITS transmission service. So you could have 10 designated resources that add up to 1,000 megawatts, and you would limit the representation to the submissions up to that 1,000 megawatts of the NITS customer load. Let me just take a look what the next slide is. Okay, so the next slides talk about CRRs, but let's pause here and let's go back to slide 14 for a second here. Just what we're talking about here is now that box at the bottom, those eligible firm out transmission rights. What we're saying is, as a starting point, it should be long-term firm point-to-point and NITS transmission rights that are represented for the EDAM balancing areas that feed into this SFT. And the question is, you know, are there other or different types of rights that should be considered? What are the merits of considering anything other than long-term firm point-to-point and NITS transmission rights? As I mentioned kind of in passing, there's inherent limitations in how much long-term firm capacity a transmission provider has available. Transmission provider doesn't just come up with long-term ATC out of thin air, but how it calculates how much ATC they have available for sale is governed by NERC standards, and it's limited by the physical capabilities of the system. They can't sell more than the physical capability of the path. And very often, and it's customary in the industry driven by NERC standards, that the long-term firm ATC that parties make available on different flow gates or paths flow gates or paths is something less than the full capability of the path, because they look to account for Margins, margins for uncertainty associated with loop flow, with load forecast uncertainty, et cetera. So if the path is rated at 3,000 megawatts, they may make, for example, some less amount available, 27 or 2,800 megawatts available that you can sell on a long-term firm basis. So they can, they don't just come out and sell more than the 3,000 megawatts that's dictated by the NERC standards. And for those in the CAISO balancing area, you may remember, 2-3 years ago or however long it's been, we went through something similar when establishing wheeling through priorities across the CAISO system, where we established an ATC methodology where you make less available on that firm basis than the full physical capability of the path, because you're trying to account for different uncertainties as well. And this is similar to that in how they sell, how the transmission providers sell firm transmission, such that by looking only at long-term firm rights, you have a level of certainty that, these parties, the transmission providers, or the rights that you're considering do not exceed the physical capabilities of the sources or of the paths that they're looking at, if depending on the ATC methodology they have. If they have flow gates, they're not exceeding the flow gate capability of that flow gate on a long-term firm basis, and similarly of a path, that they're not selling more than the physical capability of that particular line or that particular path. But wanted to open up here questions on or thoughts on, should there be other or different transmission rights considered within this common SFT when we're evaluating what level of congestion entitlement should parties be subject to. And I think we'll talk about it later as well, but what incentives that creates. And I think by looking only at long-term firm rights, it certainly continues to retain the value in the long-term firm investments that parties have made, and I think continues to incent procurement of long-term firm transmission rights to the extent that they're available on other systems. Let me pause here and just see if there's any folks that have any thoughts on. Let's go to slide 16, just to where we have the explanation of at least what the rights are eligible. But should there be other rights beyond the long-term firm out rights that should be considered here, and what are the merits of considering anything other than long-term firm point-to-point and NITS rights on EDAM entities systems under this design?
Taking a moment to see if any hands are raised. I'm not seeing any hands at this moment. Oh, it looks like we just received a hand from Pushkar Weigel. Go ahead, Pushkar.
Hi, good morning. This is Pushkar Wagle from Clean Resource Consultants on behalf of Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group and City and County of San Francisco. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hey, Miloš, I hear your point that the PTP and this NITS aren't sort of, developed from thin air. They're capped by ATC and NERC standards. But my question is that existent isn't used, right? A firm right can be nominated into SFT without being scheduled. And unlike, CRRs internally, which are disciplined by, load metric and so on. So does the common SFT would sort of reflect actual scheduled use or not just the held rights? So the question is, what stops the held but unused EDAM OT rights or external entity OT rights from crowding out the CAISO CRR feasibility on those shared constraints?
No, good question, Pushkar. And so within the SFT, we would look at least as we're looking at it at this stage, it would look at, for purposes of establishing and running that feasibility test and establishing the congestion revenue entitlement, it would look at the reserved rights, independent of schedules, for determining the feasibility. So if somebody has 100 megawatts reserved, that's what feeds into the SFT to test, are those 100 megawatts feasible to flow with the other inputs as well, and in determining the level of congestion revenue entitlement. I think in my mind that's similar, and we'll talk through in the next slides about CRRs, but CRRs as well, when parties are nominating them, they're not nominating them based on schedules. Ultimately, these congestion revenue entitlements provide you a hedge and that's most useful when you're using those rights. But I think it's comparable to the CRRs in that you're not looking at any kind of use, but you're nominating the source and sink locations that represent, in this context, represent the rights that they hold. In the CRR context, it represents the source and sink locations the parties are most interested in, or most likely to represent maybe their intended use of service from the resources. But the SFT doesn't do any kind of reductions based on schedules. It just looks at what are the rights that you paid for and you hold. Do all of those fit with the nominated with the CRRs in the process?
Understood. I was just looking in terms of the parity, and maybe when you go over later slides on 42, 43, we can discuss it further. But the question was primarily, you're constrained by your adjusted load metric in terms of how much you can sink, right? So there are clearly some restriction. I hear you in terms of the PTP and NITS also. There are certain restrictions towards it, but I'm just sort of concerned in terms of the practice of those OAT rights crowding out the CAISO CRR feasibility. So that's all I had, but maybe we could have further discussion on that later. Thank you.
Good question. Yeah, and come back as we go along into later parts of the presentation. Let's vet that out a little bit more, because I do think, at least for NITS rights, again, the limitation of the representation, the SFT, is based on load. I think the question is, would you use a load forecast or similar historical look at the prior year load, that also kind of considers the peak, but prior year's peak in the annual process. But it's fairly similar. There's a limitation based on load. On long-term firm point-to-point rights, they're not really limited by load, but there are other, like I said, physical limits on how much you can sell. And is that enough as we consider these different products within that process and the equity? So keep that thought, and as we go through maybe the next few slides, let's do a comparison, and that's a key question, really. Is there parity in how these are considered within that SFT, and what are the issues that may need to be addressed?
Great. Thank you, Miloj. That's all I had.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other hands at this moment.
Okay. This will be a theme as well as we go through other parts of the presentation. So let's go to, there we go, slide 19. So let's start now talking about considerations of CRRs within that common SFT. And again, let's look at it from that lens. We've talked about the OAT rights that would be part of this, long-term OAT rights that parties have invested into. Some are held by load serving entities serving load. Others may be held for export and wheel throughs on a long-term basis, but they're also paid for and contributing to the long-term costs of the system for the reservation period. Let's compare that now to what should be considered from a CRR perspective within that common SFT. And this slide is just a setup slide. The next slide really gets into at least those questions. But just to ground everybody, because we have folks with different level of understanding of the CAISO CRR processes and what's considered today. But CRRs in the CAISO balancing area offer a financial hedge against congestion costs based on the source and sink locations that they ultimately nominate and ultimately acquire those CRRs for. The important distinction is that the CRRs don't confer a physical right to use. If you get a CRR, you're getting that financial hedge, but it doesn't confer you any kind of need or ability or priority of use of physical transmission from those source and sink locations. They're strictly a financial congestion hedging mechanism from the source and sink locations that the party acquires the CRR for. The market is the one that ultimately identifies the most efficient dispatch and use of the physical grid within the market. Within the CAISO balancing area, CRRs can be acquired from two different processes primarily. I know that there's the ability to sell these as well, but resell these, but they're acquired mainly through the CRR allocation process, which is the first step in the process of granting CRRs, where those CRRs are allocated to load serving entities that nominate different source and sink locations, and then those are put through the SFT, and the SFT determines ultimately the level of granting those CRR nominations. But those CRRs in the allocation process, they'll grant a level of hedge to load serving entities that are serving load, which again pays for the embedded costs of the transmission system within the CAISO balancing area. And so they effectively get the first step in this process. They're the ones that are receiving an allocation, and they're the only ones eligible within this allocation to nominate these congestion revenue rights. After that process, then there is the CRR auction. After you've provided the allocations to the load serving entities through that annual SFT process, then there's a CRR auction that provides a process for other market participants that may be interested in acquiring a congestion hedge mechanism at different source and sink locations. They can participate in the auction process and pay for those rights through that auction process based on the desired source and sink locations that they want to acquire those rights through the auction. But that happens after you have determined and made the allocation to the load serving entities that's evaluated through the SFT. Are those nominations simultaneously feasible, and those uses simultaneously feasible to grant rights within the allocation process? There's also an SFT that's run within the auction process that uses the allocation as a static input, but nevertheless, the auction process comes after you perform the allocation first to the load serving entities within the balancing area. If we go to the next slide. So this next slide really tries to tee up that more substantive discussion, and certainly appreciate your inputs here and ideas. But at least the starting point is that CRRs that are nominated by the load serving entities through that allocation process would be considered within that common SFT. And so the idea is that just like today, the CAISO LSEs would nominate the source and sink locations through that allocation process, and those source and sink nominations would be part of that common SFT with the OAT rights that we talked about on the previous slides that would evaluate the feasibility on the system. I think those allocated CRRs are most akin to NITS transmission rights held by the LSEs, because again, the NITS transmission rights can only be used for serving load. They're limited by load, and similarly, the allocated CRRs to the load serving entities, the nominations are ultimately limited by the load metric that's used. You can't nominate more than load, and that load amount that's established for the entities. The nuance here is that, how do reserve point-to-point transmission rights compare so that they're considered within this process? And I think one argument is that point-to-point transmission rights maybe should be considered along with allocation and NITS transmission rights, because they've been evaluated for ATC on the host system on a long-term basis, and they pay also for the transmission costs on the system, at least on a long-term basis during the reservation period, based on that reserved amount that they've reserved from the transmission provider on a long-term basis. They're contributing to the cost of the system, or paying for the cost of the system, at least during the long-term reservation period. But that's a question again here. How should those be considered along with CRR allocations and other rights? The CRR nominations are limited to source and sinks within the CAISO balancing area, or intertie locations on the CAISO balancing area. And that remains within this common SFT process. That doesn't change. The entities can nominate those locations within the CAISO balancing area. And they would be then incorporated within the common SFT along with long-term firm point-to-point and NITS rights of the other EDAM balancing areas. And I think this is kind of the question that we've been talking through in different contexts up to this point, but are there additional or different considerations of representations of the uses of the CAISO system that ultimately yield an allocation of the congestion entitlements beyond just the allocation CRRs? Are there other considerations that should be made for the CAISO balancing area within the common SFT? Based on just the procedural aspects of how these SFTs work, in that you first go with through the allocation process in order to determine what may be available for the auction. Is there some way, or is there a need to consider auction CRRs or some assumptions to be made about auction CRRs within this process, or is only the consideration of the allocation CRRs and the long-term firm outrights the appropriate consideration within that common SFT? You know, certainly appreciate sharing your perspectives, what different inputs should be considered here. Again, keeping in mind that what the SFT yields is the level of that congestion revenue entitlement. And I think we have a couple of questions or comments. Let's go to those.
Yeah, we have a few hands raised. First we'll go to Michelle Keto. Go ahead, Michelle. Go ahead and then.
Hey, this is Michelle Keto. Hey, I just sort of looked it up and it doesn't look like nominated CRRs are posted anyplace. Could you tell us like what the level of nominated CRRs were? I mean, I think we can figure out point to point and nits, but I just want transparency on this side of it. Could you guys provide that?
Maybe I'll turn it to Philip. Philip, if you want to share where that is available on a year-to-year basis and how, yeah.
I'd have to double check exactly what's posted, but I know we do have a lot of the CRR information available within Oasis, especially the allocated
Right,
quantities.
but allocated is different than nominated, right?
It is. Yeah, I could check on that, but I'm not sure if we post those outside of the CRR system anywhere else.
But it would be really helpful information for us to understand if there's parity, right? Could
And
we
so you're
get you
looking
guys
for
to
Michelle.
post that and provide that information in this process? That would be super helpful.
Yeah, Philip, I'll defer to you. We can certainly take that back. I don't know if there are any, you know, there may be some sensitive information in terms of who's nominating what, but maybe if to
Well,
the
I'm not
extent we have
asking
the
for
info
who's
sanitized
nominating
without
what, but
who,
some,
yeah, maybe just
yeah, just some
nominated source
aggregate
and things.
information, right? That'd be super helpful.
Okay, yeah, let us take
And
that
also,
back.
you know, if we're trying for parity in terms of transparency, you know, like we can probably publicly figure out what NITs and long-term PTPs are, right?
Yeah, you should be able to get to some of that information, the magnitude of it on Oasis. It's, I think, magnitude smaller, you know, than in the CAISO probably nominations, but just because of the size of the VAs. But I think we could certainly, that should be available on the different Oasis sites of the transmission providers. And we'll talk a little bit later about, we'll talk a little bit later towards the end, but no, we'll take that back. Thank you, Michelle. Whether we can post or make transparent the nominations in some kind of a aggregate, non-attributable form that shows at least the nominated source and sinks and how that fares with what's ultimately allocated.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, at the end, we'll talk about, there's a slide, but we're planning to run a simulated SFT. And so we're gathering some of those outrights from the other EDAM entities so that we can, you know, evaluate what is this, you know, under this type of a structure, what does feasibility look like? And we'll touch on that a little bit later.
Next in the queue, we have Jordan Miner.
Hi, Jordan Miner, CPUC Energy Division. I apologize if this is the wrong place to ask this question, but I looked through the slides and I am not sure where to ask, but this is the end of the section, so I thought it was reasonable. So this is a question that overlaps between concept 3 and concept 1. My question is, how is the congestion revenue tied to the loop flows being allocated? Is it being allocated based on where that constraint materializes? So if it's a constraint in CAISO, we would get that congestion revenue tied to that loop flow in concept 3. I know in concept 1, you discussed this, but I don't see it mentioned in these slides.
Good question. I think we touched on it in one of the earlier slides that described the concept, but under this type of a structure, congestion revenues allocation would flow, flow is the wrong term to use in the context of this, but congestion revenues would follow the results of the SFT, of those nominated rights or included rights within that common SFT, the congestion revenues would flow to the relevant balancing areas based on the rights that are represented within that SFT. And then anything that remains in excess of that would flow back to the balancing area where the constraint is located. And then in real time also, and we'll talk about real time, but in real time also congestion revenues, any congestion revenues that arise in the real time market, similar to today, would flow to the balancing area where the constraint is located. So in that context, the CAISO would get congestion revenues necessary to fund the CRRs that are considered within the SFT or that emerge from these processes, and then the EDAM entities would receive the congestion revenues that stem from the rights that are represented within this common SFT, so associated with those long-term firm point-to-point and NITS rights. And then, like I said, anything in excess would flow back to the balancing area where the constraint is located in day ahead. And in real time, again, also the congestion revenues will flow to the balancing area where the constraint is located. But, yeah. The real time is also a question that we'll pose towards the end as well, but we think, that's how, makes most sense in real time what to do, but we'll touch on that later as well.
Okay, thanks. I think I got my answer in that. Thank you.
I think we have Alan.
Yes.
Hi, Alan Meck, PG&E. I just wanted to really quickly piggyback on Michelle's question and request for data. It would, I think, be really instructive if CAISO could present not only the total nominated CRRs in the allocation and the auction process, and then do a side-by-side comparison of that with the OAT, firm point-to-point sales, and NITS rights, but then also, for context, have a comparison of what is the forecasted load for that period of each of those rights that those rights are intended to cover. Because, like, I'm envisioning if the total pool of nominated CRRs in the allocation process only equals, I don't know, I'm just going to throw out a number like 80% of the expected CAISO load for the period, and then the NITS rights are like 99%, then it seems like we might have an incongruity there.
Yeah. No, good suggestion, Alan. And I think at least on how these rights are represented within the SFT in terms of, the global D-rate factor stuff we'll talk about here, because I think the idea is the idea between representing the CAISO load serving entity nominations, which again are capped by load, should be fairly similar to how NITS transmission is capped by load. But I get your request. Can we see the aggregate point-to-point transmission rights magnitude and NITS transmission rights magnitude across the broader EDAM footprint, and compare that then to the nominations of rights and the magnitude, volume of nominations on the CAISO side, more, since it sounds like we don't necessarily provide the nomination information today. So we'll do that as an action item. We are collecting this information anyway as I mentioned, we're going to run a simulated SFT. So I think we'll have a lot of that information. And so I just may need to circle back with transmission providers or the EDAM entities, but I think if we provide things in an aggregate form as a comparison just in magnitudes, I think we can mask any sensitive information to that extent. But yeah, that's a fair ask, and I think we can look to do that. Good suggestion by you and Michelle.
Thank you.
And I'm not seeing any other hands at the moment, so I think we can continue on.
Okay, so this will be one of the key questions that we'll ask in the comment template in particular, and we certainly appreciate your input on that. So think about it a little bit more. Some of it, as we go to the next slides, we can come back to this as well. But this is really the key area of creating that comparability of representation within the common SFT. So let's go to the next slide. Oh, I see Alan. I don't know if he's still has a question.
Alan, did you have a follow-up question? I think it's maybe an old hand, yeah.
Okay, well, I'll just note it is 11 o'clock, so just to keep, I think we'll keep pushing through that, but if any of you need to step away, for a quick break or get a bite to eat or coffee, by all means, feel free to do so, as it's a virtual meeting, but we'll keep pushing through this. We'll see as we get a little bit closer, are we going to get through everything? But if not, we can schedule a follow-up next week to continue the discussion. But I think it's important to stimulate discussion at this level at every stage of this presentation so that it can inform good comments. So let's go to the next slide. So next, what we'll talk about is, we talked about what are the different rights, the CRRs and the OAT rights that will be represented or could be represented within this process. So let's talk a little bit about the process itself. How would the SFT, assuming that we've identified the sets of rights, OAT rights and CRRs that will be captured within the SFT, how would the SFT process run and what would it produce? And we've got a set of inputs, and then Philip is going to walk through some examples as well. But this is now familiarizing ourselves with the process. And as a starting point, we're trying to leverage as much of the existing process that we perform in running the SFT, especially because we're trying to integrate CRRs with OAT rights into a common SFT. So the starting point is, let's use as much as we can of the existing processes and the existing structures as we can. To the extent that we identify some issues that need to be addressed, there could be modifications from that. But let's start with the process as we know it today. And the starting point is that we would run an annual SFT process. And this process is run roughly 4 to 5 months prior to the start of the next calendar year. In the context of CAISO CRRs, we're in the midst of that process now, right in this month in terms of in August, for trying to look at running the SFT and creating those entitlements for the next calendar year. So this is roughly the time frame where you would run that SFT, right in August or so. The annual SFT is run in quarterly chunks. It's run across different seasons that correspond to the calendar months, as you can see there. Quarter one, it just covers the calendar year periods, January through March. The season 3 is really, I think, the critical one that's you're running it in the summer months, July through August through September, and then you got season 4, which is October through December. So follows the calendar year in quarterly increments, and you're running an SFT for each quarter. So the rights that parties give you, the OAT rights that are included would be incorporated into each quarterly run of the SFT, and each quarterly run may have a different input. For example, for NITS rights, you would look at the loads for that particular quarter, but you would get through every quarterly run. Importantly, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, is how much of the system of the transmission capacity now across that wider EDAM footprint, how much of that transmission capacity is represented within that common SFT. The starting point is similar to what we do today in the annual SFT process that considers 65% of the transmission capacity in the annual process. This is known as that global D-rate factor, and it's really intended to recognize uncertainty, because you're running this SFT a year in advance, right? You're running it and making allocations for the year. And so you may not have the most up-to-date information, and there's uncertainty associated with outages. You may not, there are outages that are going to materialize after you run that SFT that you may not have visibility into yet. So it accounts for uncertainty with topology changes, topology differences as you get closer to the actual operational time frame, outage uncertainty, as well as up to date, it's been accounting for some aspect of loop flow effect, right? That you shouldn't consider the entire system in the annual process because of all of these uncertainties, including including loop flow. But it's really a catch-all global derate factor that accounts for uncertainty with topology nuances overall and topology uncertainty overall. Looking at a broader EDAM footprint now, let's say it's 10 balancing areas that you're looking at now, not just the CAISO balancing area, but those 10 balancing areas across the West. You'll certainly have a better representation of the loop flow effects because you're considering now that interconnected system. And we also may have better ability to account for loop flows from other non-market balancing areas based on some of the recent modifications and approvals that we received in how you model in the CRRs. But the question is really, is there an opportunity within this process then, as you're incorporating all of these different balancing areas and outrights, is there an opportunity potentially to consider still stay with that 65% global derate factor, or potentially consider maybe a higher number, recognizing that you have some ability to mitigate some of that uncertainty now because you're considering the wider EDAM footprint? Probably not significantly higher, but it's a question I think that could be considered as you're looking at the wider EDAM footprint. I think we have a question. Let's pause here.
Yeah, looks like we have a question from Callie Wells.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I just have a very quick question that just occurred to me. So I know you said prior that the outrights are ones that are for a year or more. And maybe this scenario doesn't actually happen, so my question is pointless. But could you have a situation where maybe an outright ends in August of the year that you're modeling? And if so, would that outright be included in the annual process for Q1, Q2, and then they wait for the monthly process for Q3 for July and August, or how would that work?
No, great question, Callie. And yes, you could have annual long-term firm point-to-point or NITS rights terminating kind of mid-year. They don't necessarily have to follow calendar year endings. And so yes, you could have that. I think the key question would be, at the time that you're running this SFT, the annual SFT, 4 to 5 months, ahead of the year, so August, are those reservations in place in that time frame? You're looking at what reservations are in place at this time. So to the extent that there's a reservation that ends in August of next year, yes, you would represent that reservation all the way through the relevant quarter. If there's a reservation that starts in September of next year, and it's reserved and it's available in this time frame, then yes, you could model that reservation in the starting with the relevant quarter. To the extent that you can't catch that within this annual process, and some of these reservations come in later after you run this annual SFT, I think you can incorporate, you'll see that later, I think there's an opportunity potentially to incorporate that within and reflect that once you run the monthly SFT. But the idea here is, what are the reservations that you have on your system as of the time that you're performing the annual SFT? And yes, some could terminate mid-year, others could start mid-year, and you would look to capture those in the relevant inputs, in the relevant quarter.
Okay, and just to confirm, so if it ends or starts kind of mid-quarter, you would include it in that quarter in the annual process, or would you not, and you would wait till the monthly to capture the months that it's valid for in that quarter?
Yeah, that's a good nuanced question. I think that's something we could consider if something ends mid-month. I'm not sure if long-term reservations, if they terminate mid-month, or what the practice is. I have to double check, how realistic is it that some long-term reservations terminate mid-month? Yeah.
Sorry, mid-quarter.
Yeah, but mid-quarter, I think we can consider what makes the most sense. If it terminates mid-quarter, there may be an opportunity to still capture it within because they probably want the certainty that you get by being included in the annual SFT. But that's a good question. I think we can consider some of those nuances if it's better to fit it in. If you have 2 out of the 3 quarters, maybe it makes sense to consider the annual, but if it's just one, maybe to the monthly. But But that's a good nuance that we can consider, and if folks have particular thoughts on that, please include them in your comments. But I think there's flexibility here to account for them. The risk is that, if you only have one quarter in the annual timeframe, it may take up space in the annual process. That maybe, create some infeasibility for other rights. But it also does provide you certainty by being in the annual process. It could provide you certainty, at least for a period of the quarter. And I don't know, Philip, to what extent are, within the SFT, are we able to reflect within these quarters, maybe some nuanced terminations if certain rights terminate mid-quarter, within, April, but, don't cover May and June. To what extent is the SFT able to capture, some of those nuanced termination periods and consider them within the run?
Yeah, so as far as the SFT and the seasonal basis there, any awards associated with a particular season would be applicable for all months of that season, and the SFT is associated with that entire season. So I guess my initial thoughts on that would be either the rights would need to be effective for the entirety of the season in order to be included in that season, unless we wanted to think about a way to allow them to be nominated and awarded for an entire season, and then somehow remove the entitlements associated with at a monthly granularity, which that might get a little bit more complicated. But I think the most straightforward way would, based on the current SFT design, would be just have rights that are effective for the entirety of a season to be considered within that season.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate it. We'll give it some thought to it. Just that question just occurred to me. And like I said, maybe we don't have many rights at all that end mid-season, and then it's pretty straightforward. But thank you, I appreciate it. Wasn't sure if you guys had given any thought there.
No, good thought, Callie. And I think you're right. I think these, particularly oat rights, at least in my experience, they terminate all kinds of different months. They're not necessarily terminating, kind of aligning with quarters. So that's a good question. And I think we can consider, how frequent does that happen, and what makes the most sense? Is it, as Philip said, you got to be effective for the entire season to be within it? Otherwise, you move them to the monthly, or vice versa. Is there value in considering some of that certainty, at least even for a month within the annual process? And what are the trade-offs? But great question, and we'll think about it more and certainly invite comment on that.
Great, thanks, appreciate it.
Thanks, Callie. Next, we have a hand from Justin.
Hi. I could probably just put this in comments, but I do kind of want to get a reaction from the CAISO while we're discussing the topic. This might be an opportunity to change the annual SFT so that it is optimizing solving on a monthly basis. We've said in the CRR enhancements working group comments, many comments, I'm not even sure when, but at some point, we were pointing out that if the annual was done on the basis of months, that would actually line up better with the monthly process and be more efficient, but also, maybe be a stepping stone to having more auctions. But, I know that's a different topic. But anyway, I think that if there's an alignment issue with the oat rights and they're going to be put in the SFT, I think thinking outside of the box and saying, okay, well, we can optimize the annuals on a monthly basis. It would still be annual, but it would be 12 months instead of 4 quarters within that annual optimization. Does that seem like something that the CAISO could pursue as part of this effort?
Just a clarification on that. Are you meaning that we wouldn't have any more the seasonal models, but rather just monthly? So we would have to run basically 12 auctions, allocations per year in the annual process?
Right. So there just wouldn't be the seasonal. It would just be There wouldn't be the seasonal quarterly, there would just be months, 12 months in the annual process instead of 4 in the annual process.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Yeah, we can take that back and talk with the relevant groups and their thoughts of the trade-offs. And you know, sounds like well, there could be benefits there. There's some complexities as well to this, especially as running this more frequently. But yeah, let us take that back and appreciate that thought. Add it to your comments if you wouldn't mind as well.
Right, right. And while I'm off mute, I'll just say, while we're talking about the global D-rate factor, you know, enhancing the outage reporting, better modeling the loop flow, and then also dealing with, you know, all of the different improvements that could be done for congestion revenue allocation. Congestion revenue inadequacy. Sorry, congestion revenue inadequacy in the CAISO could eventually help you, I guess, raise or lower, whatever, you know, have a higher percentage allocation of CRRs to load in California. So those kind of enhancements would go, you know, I understand now, I'm not advocating for getting rid of the global D-rate factor now or even reducing the global D-rate factor immediately, but those types of improvements could help you do that. So I think it's worth continuing to work on those issues in the CRR enhancements working group. I think it goes hand in hand with this. So anyway, I'm just, I'll put that in my comments as well. We've said many times.
No. Good thoughts. Yeah. And we recognize that as you consider this common SFT, and we're raising some questions that are also overlapping with some of the discussions in the CRR, we wanted to tease those out and you know, raise the kind of, are these additional factors that you know, if you're creating a common SFT that contribute to that consideration of adjusting the global D-rate factor? Are there benefits beyond just, you know, by considering that common SFT and improved outage information now across a wider EDAM footprint with the ability to actually model the effects of those loop flows within that broader EDAM footprint, especially as it grows, is that additional factor that maybe allows for evaluating adjustments to that 65%. But the reason I wanted to highlight that here again is because there's a number of entities, particularly the EDAM entities, where this is new. This whole process is new. So it's important to highlight, you know, how in the annual process to manage some of that uncertainty, you're not considering the full capacity of the system. You're considering 65%. And then as you move to the monthly, you open up more of the system because you have better information and you can, you know, as you'll see, that leads to potential additional allocations of congestion entitlements above and beyond those that you may have received in the annual process. So thank you for those thoughts.
And thank you. I appreciate that you're thinking along these lines.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the next slide, and Philip, maybe I'll turn it over to you if you just want to cover a little bit some of the types of constraints that are considered within the SFT, just to familiarize folks. How does that compare or differ from the constraints that are actually enforced in the market itself? How similar or different may those be?
Sure. So for the most part, the CR SFT is trying to be consistent as much as possible with the constraints that are enforced in the market. So the same set of transmission lines and transformers that are enforced, we are also enforcing those. We do enforce the normal sort of base case ratings as well as the emergency ratings. And the emergency ratings are enforced during the contingency analysis, so the N-1 cases, with all of the, you know, attempting to have a very similar set of contingencies as defined in the market. We do also include nomograms and interfaces, so the same sort of ITC limits that are enforced in the market. We are also pulling those in and modeling those as consistently as we can. That's kind of a high level there.
No, thank you, Philip. We have a question from Jordan.
Go ahead, Jordan.
Hi, Jordan Miner again. So this is a conversation that's come up in CR enhancements and configurable parameters. But my understanding is that there are constraints in the IFM that we do not enforce because of market solving time, but there are constraints in the SFT that we do enforce because we have more time to solve the market. So when you say extent possible, are we trying to minimize that constraint divergence or get rid of it? I guess extent possible is kind of vague. So can we get more expansion on how CAISO views that playing out?
Yeah, to the extent possible, I think in this context refers to some of the inherent differences between the model that the CRR team uses and the market uses. So we utilize a DC model. So if there are things like voltage stability constraints that are enforced in the market, we don't really have that same set of constraints within the CRR model just because of those inherent differences. But the overall intention is, we want to have a set of CRRs that come out of the SFT which align with the market flows as much as possible so that the expected value of the CRRs can be funded by congestion rents. That's really the goal. And then, to the extent possible, to me, I think a lot of that is just, what we can model that aligns with the market, given the inherent differences in our model.
Yeah, and Philip, if I can just ask a clarification question to Jordan. Jordan, could you elaborate more on the comment that you were making about not enforcing certain constraints? I just want to make sure that we answer that properly because I have a feeling where the question is, but I don't want to make assumptions. Can you expand on that comment?
Yeah, thanks, Guillermo. Because my question was about that. There are constraints in the IFM we don't enforce, is my understanding, because to enforce them would increase the solving time too much of the IFM and wouldn't be able to solve by 1 p.m. every day. But we don't have that time constraint in the CRR model, so we enforce everything.
Yeah, but could you expand on that? For instance, what the constraints you are referring to?
I mean, I can't remember off my head, but I think the contingency constraints.
Okay, let me clarify because there is. Sorry, Philip, let me clarify that because there is a misunderstanding. What we have discussed in other forums regarding the computational concerns of enforcing all the constraints is specific for imbalance reserves. For energy, we are indeed enforcing in both the IFM, the day ahead, the real time, and the CRR market, all the physical constraints that we have for energy. The subset of constraints that we are not enforcing in the day ahead market and the real time is specific for imbalance reserves.
Thank you for the clarification.
Thank you, Jordan. And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time, so I think we can continue on.
Okay. Well, let's go to the next slide. On the next slide, now we're shifting into the actual process itself of identifying or nominating or submitting those rights and how they're evaluated through the different tiers of the SFT process. And I'll start here, and then I'll turn it over to Philip just briefly to clarify, and then Philip is going to walk us through some illustrative examples of how CRRs and OAT rights under this kind of annual tiered SFT process would be reflected through the different tiered structures and what the SFT provides. But as a starting point, just to familiarize folks that are not familiar with the SFT that we currently run in the CAISO is that there's a tiered process through which we run the SFT that allows for more gradual capacity scaling to evaluate feasibility at different stages, ensuring, again, that those physical capabilities of the grid are respected and not over-allocated, and also making sure that, you know, since we're considering only 65% of the system in the annual process, we can properly reflect the rights in you know, in the priorities of these different rights through the different tiers. So the way that occurs is that within tier 1, for example, this is what we would consider up to 50% of the, you know, today it's considered up to 50% of the CRRs, nominated CRRs, up to that 50% load metric that it has. And then it also includes CRRs based on source and sink combinations based on prior year allocations that can be nominated within this tier. How that would translate to OAT rights within this first tier is that the EDAM entities would identify, you know, up to 50% of the point-to-point rights and the NITS rights based on that 50% load metric. You know, that's one way that this could work, is, again, applying that same metric in tier 1 to 50% of the rights and 50% of the NITS load metric could be nominated within or submitted within this tier 1. The SFT runs, identifies the level of feasibilities and feasibilities, and then tier 2 comes in next, which you again nominate now up to two-thirds of those rights into that second tier, and the SFT runs again to evaluate the feasibility with two-thirds of the rights on the system. And then the third tier is, you know, it runs with all of the, whatever hasn't been already awarded or nominated within those prior tiers. Now you incorporate everything, all the remaining amounts within that third tier to evaluate the feasibility when you consider all of the eligible firm OAT rights and NITS rights up to that 100% load metric that are reflected within the SFT. So you're running the SFT kind of in tiers to evaluate feasibility at different stages, adding more rights at every stage to evaluate, again, how do these rights fit, so you can better align and evaluate the feasibilities, the constraints, and what's needed to accommodate the full set of rights. To illustrate that, I'll turn it over to Philip, who's going to walk you through a couple of examples now on how do these, in an annual SFT context, how do you incorporate OAT rights and CRRs within this tiered structure. And we've made some assumptions. We've got an illustration and some assumptions about certain rights more simplistically, just to, again, illustrate the flow through the different tiers. And I'll turn it over to, if we go to the next slide, let's turn it over to Philip to walk us through this graphic.
Sure. Thanks, Niels. Yes, so in this slide here, we have a visual which we'll refer back to in a couple parts of the presentation, just to show a representation of different types of rights that would be included into the SFT and how those would translate into eligible quantities to be nominated into the different tiers. So for illustration purposes here, we've set up a few NITS and point-to-point rights in a couple different BAs there, and then within CAISO, 200 megawatt of a load value. So we'll refer to that as the load metric associated with that path, and we'll show how those would fit into the SFT. So we go to the next slide, please. Okay. And I should give a disclaimer. This is a bit of an oversimplified description, especially for the CRR nomination amount. There are some other variables that come into play as far as determining the seasonal eligible quantity, mainly the load migration, and there are any legacy rights associated with that entity. But conceptually, it should be okay. So we could see here for each of those different NITS, point-to-point, and the CRR eligibility, the load metric, which was on the prior slide, is for the CRR nomination, that would be representative of their load metric value. For the NITS and point-to-point, that would be the rights they have associated, the quantity of rights they have associated with those particular either NITS or point-to-point service. And so the idea would be for tier 1, which for CRR purposes is based on 50% of the load metric. You can see the values that would be eligible to be nominated within tier 1 of the SFT would be 50% of that starting point. We put in some potential, just theoretically, just for example purposes, what the awards could be coming out of tier 1 to show how that would translate into the subsequent rounds here. So if we assume, let's say the top nomination for the NITS 1 is fully allocated, and the bottom 2 records, the second NITS rights and the second point-to-point right, were fully awarded, with one of the point-to-point rights and one of the CR nomination being partially curtailed there. And I'll show later in the presentation kind of an example of how that could occur, what that would look like. Either way, you can see based on what's awarded in tier 1, that would then impact the eligibility for tier 2. So the starting point for tier 2 is 2/3 of the load metric value, and then the final eligible quantity into tier 2 is that starting point, 2/3 of your load metric, and then subtract out what has already been allocated. So in the top row, for example, 2/3 of the 80 megawatts would be 53.333. And so since they were already awarded 40 megawatts in tier 1, they could nominate the remaining 13.333 if desired there. Continuing just with that example, if let's say they were awarded 10 megawatts in tier 2, you can follow along there that moving into tier 3, the starting point is the full load metric amount, 100% of that. So starting with the 80 megawatts, they could nominate basically whatever they have not already been awarded. So in this case, they have already been awarded 50 megawatts, which leaves 30. So 30 would be eligible to be nominated into tier 3. And, they could have a chance to get awarded based on that. Worth noting here, the bullet points at the bottom. So in the annual process, as we've referred to previously, we do make only 65% of the expected transmission capacity available. So that could result in, allocation amount less than what's supported by the full transmission system. It would result in that. It's the intention. But whatever's not allocated or fully awarded in the annual process could be also attempted to be nominated in the monthly process. So we'll kind of move to that next as far as what these would look like moving into a monthly process.
Right, the 21st.
So I'll pause here. I know, Milos, did you have anything to add before we move on there?
No, thank you for that. Yeah, the only piece I wanted to add, if folks add up kind of the tier 1, 2, and 3, you'll see, as Philip said, not everything is allocated not everything may be allocated in the annual process because of that global derate factor that accounts for uncertainty, because you're doing this so far in advance. But as you'll see a little bit later in a couple of slides from here, when the monthly process provides the opportunity to provide additional allocations that should get you closer, to those rights. Yeah, but go ahead, Philip. Go ahead. Next slide.
Okay. All right. So then moving on to the monthly process. So for the monthly SFT process, it's roughly a month ahead of the effective month. We start about 6 weeks prior with some of the activities leading up to that, such as preparing and posting the model, as well as the eligible quantities. And then the actual nomination and results are carried out the month prior to the effective month. The monthly SFT represents the available transmission capacity adjusted for known transmission outages and any topology changes. So we have typically more information leading into the monthly process than was available at the time we execute our annual process, especially for the months farther out within the calendar year. And then currently in our monthly process, we are applying a D-rate factor, making 82.5% of capacity available. It's worth mentioning as well. And then for tier 1, again, this would be the first opportunity in the monthly process to request rights here. So we'll walk through an example in the next slide, but basically any remaining amount, the difference between the load metric and awards that have already come out of the annual could be nominated in tier 1 of the monthly process. And then in tier 2, it's basically whatever you didn't get in tier 1, you can try again for tier 2. I think that covers that slide. If we can move to the next, please. All right, so here are what those same nominations from the annual would look like moving into the monthly process. So we just focus on the top row here, the 80 megawatts worth of NIPS rights. The example we had, they were awarded 65 megawatts through the 3 tiers of the annual process, which leaves 15 remaining to be nominated into the monthly tier 1. If we were to clear 14 megawatts worth of awards in tier 1, then they could nominate the remaining 1 megawatt in tier 2. So we put together just a few examples showing, what that would look like if certain amounts were awarded or curtailed, and kind of follow those through from the annual all the way through the monthly. I'll pause there, maybe if there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. And as you can see here, again, we try to illustrate is that going through that annual and the monthly process, it could result in getting the full congestion hedge depending on feasibility, that aligns with the physical rights under the oath that were granted, or it could be some amount less, depending upon, if you look at that last column in these examples, it will be some amount less based on the different infeasibilities that may be encountered across the system as you run the SFT. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this, but my expectation would be that by limiting the allocations to long-term firm OAT rights and some aspect of allocation CRRs and maybe even others, you would get a high level of feasibility just because you're looking at just a subset and the long-term firm rights based on how those are calculated. But again, depending on the feasibility ultimate test, that's where, in that last column, you can see some rights could get their full amount for that particular season or period. Others could, or month, others could get some form of reduction based upon the constraints that may be binding. And as you'll see in the next section, we'll talk about how do these reductions happen? How do those rights that were submitted at 100, how did it result in 94 megawatts of congestion revenue entitlement instead of 100? What drives that? How is at least the current methodology for applying reductions in order to create that feasibility? But let's pause here and see if there are any procedural questions before we get into that next section on the haircutting or reductions and how do those happen and how could they happen in this common SFT.
Looks like we have one hand raised from Steve Keen. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, Steve Keen from Edison, and I think I may be getting at the same thing, but when you do the haircuts and stuff, I get that. But what I'm asking is, how are you limiting the amount that can be bid in? If the non-CAISO entities, for example.
You mean how you're limiting or identifying the amount that can be submitted into the SFT?
Yes, because for the CAISO, it's limited. They're limited by their load, so you can't. At least typically that's the way it's been done. You can't put in more bids than you have load, and you're not talking about doing the auction piece, so we can leave it at that. But when you get to the oak transmission, that same limit may apply to some of the NITS pieces, but to the point-to-point, how do you make sure that the amount that the individual BAAs have sold is, you know, is comparable, and that they're not able to just sell a whole lot and then get more allocated to them in the SFT.
Yeah. No, good question, Stephen. And, you know, we touched on it a little bit, but let me expand on it here. You know, I think it all comes down to what rights are eligible. And like we said before, the rights that are eligible are those transmission rights that have been sold on a long-term basis, those long-term firm point-to-point and its transmission rights. You're not considering anything else. As a starting point, there's a finite amount of capacity. They can't, like I said before, they can't just come up with, transmission providers don't just come up with capacity out of thin air and oversell paths on a long-term basis with firm ATC. There's strict standards, similar to what we've established for our wheel-throughs, for example, where you calculate how much you have available on a long-term basis that's some amount less than the physical capability of the path. So by limiting this to long-term firm rights, I think you're inherently limiting what can fit into this SFT. From the NITS perspective, NITS transmission rights, long-term firm NITS transmission rights, the limit, you know, is its load, NITS load. And so through this process, as we've illustrated, you know, through each tier, you're representing 50% of the load, and then as you go through tiers, you add more. So you're adding resources, designated network resources up to the load, up to 50% of the load, and then, you know, 2/3, and then 100% of the load. And then for point-to-point, long-term firm point-to-point transmission rights, the limitation is the reserved amount. So they're not nominating 300 megawatts if they got a reservation of 100. So it goes based on the long-term firm reserve point-to-point. So 50% in tier one, you know, if it's a 100 megawatt reservation, 50% of that reservation is in tier one, and then you similarly go through the tiers. So it's limited by the rights that are granted and held and paid for under that transmission provider's system. And again, there's a finite amount of long-term firm capacity in the West. You know, unless you build, there's no more really to go around. And then the reservations, how much you have available for sale, is really dictated in part by NERC standards that you're not selling more than the full capacity of the line, and you're selling oftentimes less on a long-term firm basis because you have different margins. And so what goes in here is limited by the reservation that has been granted by the transmission provider.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I'm going to try and put this in terms of how I'm thinking about it and understanding it. If different transmission providers, when they're selling those out rights, use essentially a different global D-rate factor, and then we go and put them in the SFT where there's a set global D-rate factor, does that create a problem?
Yeah, good question. So you know, different transmission providers have different nuances in ATC methodologies, but like I said, by limiting this to long-term firm rights, there's a common and NERC-driven standards for how they calculate long-term firm ATC. There's some variation with different margins, but by and large, it's fairly similar. They don't apply. There's no global D-rate factor, but there's that ATC methodology of how much they make available for sale on a long-term firm basis. That's fairly common, fairly standard, but there are some nuances between them. Once you put all of those, you know, the global D-rate factor applies in this SFT. So when you're looking at the full EDAM footprint, you're applying that global D-rate factor facility. So you're considering within the annual process, you're looking only at 65% of the EDAM footprint transmission capacity because of what we talked about, the uncertainty of outages, flows, topology in the annual process. You will be looking at 65% of the EDAM-wide footprint capacity when you're evaluating the SFT. And then in the monthly, you make, you know, that loosens up, that grows so that you can evaluate the feasibility more broadly in the monthly process with better information. But the global D-rate factor is a factor of the common SFT that would apply across all of these rights. You know, you put in the out rights and the CRRs, it's looking to see in the annual process how does it fare under a 65% global derate factor of the facilities? And that establishes the annual entitlements.
No, I understand that. The point that what I'm trying to understand is, if these entities only gave up NITS rights and, those were limited by the amount of load, that would put them in a similar boat to the CRRs that we have. And I would be comfortable that things would work out fairly evenly. However, that's not the case. In these OAT transmission areas, you can also get point-to-point rights. And they've given out both the NITS and the point-to-point rights. That's something that doesn't really exist in the CAISO. And the extent to which they've given out those point-to-point rights, the extent to which they've sold their system, and this and maybe you're right that there are specific rules about how much you can do that, and it's not an issue, but that's something that I would appreciate some more information on, and any analysis as to how much is actually being sold in each of these areas. So, like in these other areas, if you add up the NITS and the point-to-point, how much of the transmission capacity within that entity are they actually selling? And is that similar? So in the CAISO overall, when you look at everything, we use a 17.5% global derate factor. Are they doing something similar, or are they selling it up to 95%, or are they actually stopping at 80%, or that sort of stuff? I think would be helpful for those of us not that familiar with how this process works to understand what might happen in this SFT where it all kind of comes together then.
Yeah. No, that sounds good, Steve. I think that's consistent with the other asks by someone or a couple of folks earlier. If we can provide some information on the magnitude of nominations of CRRs within the CAISO, and then compare that to the magnitude of granted long-term firm point-to-point and aggregate long-term firm point-to-point and NITS rights. And just so you can see the magnitude and the volumes. But the important nuance and the significant nuance is, again, that on the CAISO system, we're not selling physical rights on a forward basis. They do under the OAT, and so that's where the OAT rights, and they're selling capacity across lines on a long-term firm basis under an established ATC methodology. But yeah, we can compare. I think that was one of the action items, see if we can gather data to compare, just give you a rough sense of magnitude of what volume of NITS transmission rights and point-to-point rights we're talking about in other systems, and how does that compare to the nominations that we receive on our system based on, the magnitude of load on the CAISO system.
Thanks, Steve. And I see we have one more hand raised, but in the interest of time, doing a time check, we do have 10 minutes left. Should we continue?
Yeah, maybe let's, we just want to get through the next section, which is fairly straightforward, but I think it's important to round out the discussion, and then I think we can pause and we'll schedule another date to next week to finish out the presentation, and maybe we can even act on some of the asks from this meeting. But I think it'll be important to round out this picture, because there was a number of questions on how do the reductions or haircutting in congestion entitlements, how does that work based on within the SFT? If the SFT identifies an infeasibility, how are the different inputs, the CRRs and the OAT rights that are incorporated, how are those reduced to create the feasibility? And ultimately that reduction results in the congestion revenue entitlement. So I'll turn it over to Philip, and then after that, after we pause here, we can take any kind of remaining questions, and we'll talk about scheduling the next follow-up to finish this out. But go ahead, Philip, on this slide, if you can see it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the methodology that CAISO uses within the SFT to reduce nominations that are not feasible is a weighted least squares methodology. It's also utilized by most other ISOs and RTOs that have similar processes. I think the main alternative is just a simple maximization of awards based on cutting the highest shift factor impact to constraints first, but for a variety of reasons, it's been landed on that the weighted least squares is maybe a better way to do that, or a more agreeable way to do that. So that's what's utilized. If we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so I won't spend too much time with the mathematical details here, but I will note that there are some examples and a lot more thorough explanation of weighted least squares within the congestion revenue rights BPM. It's I think there's a whole appendix section on it. So I used an example from there within the next slide. So if you want to see the formulas behind that with more detail, I will just point to that. But at a high level, the objective function is to minimize the amount of curtailment, and it is doing that based on the square of curtailment for all nominations. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay. And I should have mentioned the prior slide, but it's okay. We can keep going here, that the shift factor of nominations to overloaded constraints is a vital variable within that calculation that determines which nominations are reduced or curtailed. So we've used the same example set of nominations or rights that would lead to nominations previously here to show what that could look like going into an SFT and what, you know, how those would be curtailed given an overload with different nominations having a sensitivity to that. So if we were to put an example here, we've thrown in this line ABC as overloaded by 10 megawatts within the CAISO system there. And if we put, for example purposes, that the NITS 1, that right from G1 to LSE1 has a 0.2 shift factor to that constraint, and the CAISO G2 to LSE2, that nomination has a 0.5 shift factor to that constraint, with none of the other paths having any shift factor to that. We'll see how that plays out. So we can move to the next slide. Okay, so just again, following from the previous slide here, the shift factor in that third column there. So we're saying if the point-to-point right has a 0.2 shift factor, meaning effectively 20% of the flows across that path would impact the constraint in question. And the CRR1 nomination that has a 0.5 shift factor, meaning half of the flow across that would impact the binding constraint. Or, you know, you could look at it, you know, any megawatt you flow across that would put half a megawatt flow on the constraint in question. Applying the formulas associated with the weighted least squares, you can arrive at how much of a reduction of the overload each nomination is attributed for or accountable for there. So using those formulas within the CR BPM, we could see that the point-to-point one nomination based on its nominated megawatt and shift factor, it would be assigned to reduce 0.71 megawatts of overload, while the CRR1 nomination would be attributed to reducing 9.259 of that 10 megawatt overload. So it has to do with both the nomination amount and the shift factor of that nomination relative to all of the nominations and their shift factors, which could alleviate the congestion. Those are kind of the main inputs that determine which nominations get curtailed and by how much. As you can see, the nominations which don't have any impact to that constraint would not be curtailed or reduced at all. So the three paths which are not sensitive to that overloaded constraint would not be curtailed at all in this example, or with weighted least squares methodology in general, I should say. So continuing with this example, the two paths that are sensitive to this overloaded constraint would be curtailed proportionally based on you know, those formulas I've mentioned before. So the point-to-point nomination would be curtailed or not fully awarded by 3.705 megawatts. And the CRR1 nomination ID, that would be haircut by 18.518 megawatts to achieve a total reduction of that constraint overload of the 10 megawatt. And so you can see what that looks like from the awarded megawatt, where 3 of those nominations that were not sensitive are fully awarded, and then the 2 that are sensitive to that overload will be curtailed by differing amounts based on their sensitivity and nomination amount. I know that was a lot to cover in just a couple minutes. Hopefully I didn't rush through it too much there, but I'll pause there.
Do you wanna, Philip, you wanna finish just the last 2 examples just to illustrate just the other scenario, depending on where the constraint is? Let's go to the next slide. Just if you can capture, there could be scenarios depending on where the constraint is that it impacts just rights that are in one BA and not the other BAs. That this is not a pro rata impact to everybody, but it's really looking at the weighing of the shift factor effects to the constraint, and it could be wholly subsumed to a single balancing area.
Sure. Yep. So in the next example here, we've put together a hypothetical here where there's a line over in NVE area there overloaded by 3 megawatts, that the only nomination with any sensitivity to that would be this point-to-point 2 right. So that 80 megawatt right from that source to sink would have a 0.75 shift factor for this example, and all of the other nominations would not have any shift factor. So if we go to the next slide, please. We'll see how that would play out there. So we can see that the constraint reduction of 3 megawatts would all be assigned to the only nomination with any sensitivity there, which is that point-to-point 2. And in order to resolve that 3 megawatts of overloading, that particular nomination would need to be curtailed 4 megawatts. So in this example, that would be the only constraint not fully allocated or fully awarded. It would be awarded 36 megawatts out of the requested 40, and all of the other nominations would be fully awarded.
Okay. Thank you, Philip. So these, this is the current approach that we have for reducing rights or inputs in order to get the feasibility. Part of the question is, and would appreciate your comments on, is this the equitable way of doing it? This is the common way that's done with similar kinds of financial products in other markets that looks at the effectiveness of the constraint, but certainly if there are other alternatives and the merits of it, we certainly, can consider that. In the interest of time, let's take these next 3 questions. I don't want to cut folks off. We will schedule a follow-up session next week for an hour or so just to finish out and the rest of the slides, and we may be able to act on some of the suggestions that you had by then if we have enough time. But let's take these next 3 questions and then we can adjourn.
Yeah, so try to keep your questions a little succinct so that we have time to give a response to everyone. Next, we have Michelle Keto.
Yeah, so 2 quick comments. It seems to me that you guys have to also consider the available transmission capability that you award across our system. That's not based on feasibility. That's just based on availability at the import tie. So I think you have to think about how that's going to be modeled in this, or maybe it's an outcome. And so if we're reducing CRRs, it seems like maybe across like path 15, for example, maybe we can't award ATC. That's my first question. And then also just sort of in a broader way, CRRs, if it's basically to try to keep transmission owners whole for their transmission, it seems like the cross-border issue has to be addressed, because it's not that they should be entitled to CRRs on our system if they cause the congestion. So it limits the amount of hedging that we can do on our internal system, which was kind of the point of it. I mean, I get it, maybe if you're in a full RTO, but if you're not in a full RTO, it seems like possibly this results in an inequitable outcome. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. And just on your first comment, you're referring to the wheel-through ATC?
Yes, right? Because we don't consider internal transmission, but now what we're talking all about is congestion. So if we're going to be limiting the CRR rights across our system, I'm not sure how we can, I mean, you have to sort of consider the ATC. Like then it seems that the ATC isn't really feasible. Before you were talking about ATC as being feasible awards, but in our case, we don't consider the internal feasibility of those. So I think we have a disconnect there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Todd and then Stephen.
If we could mute Todd, please.
Todd Ryan, Pacific Gas and Electric. Yeah, similar to Michelle, I understand the rationale for this curtailment, for lack of a better word, process when you're within one transmission planning footprint, but inherently it doesn't give any kind of priority to the internal nomination over an external nomination necessarily. And it would seem to me like definitely better than the highest shift factor first, because the highest shift factor is likely to be the one closest to it and internal. So that would be giving the external nominator a high priority over the person who's paid for the transmission. But it seems like those that have been participating in paying for the transmission should be curtailed after external people who have not been paying for the transmission, unless there was some kind of hurdle rate or something that like accounted for the fact that maybe those people should be paying for the loop flow that they're causing. So it just kind of seems like this is inherently not equitable, especially given the analysis Guillermo's team has done showing that the topology of the West is not necessarily equitable.
Okay, no, fair point, Todd, and that's certainly appreciate any comments on that and reactions from other stakeholders and comments to a different type of approach. So thank you for those thoughts. That's
Next, we'll go to Steve Keen.
Hi, Steve Keen from Edison. I have a specific question about this example. I'm having trouble understanding why this would be caught in the SFT here, because the example you're using, this isn't really an example of loop flow. This is happening in the same BAA that sold the right. So if they've oversold that line, isn't that a problem in their transmission sales, since it's a point-to-point, and basically they've sold something that's causing an overload?
Yeah, but keep in mind that in the annual process, for example, and even the monthly process, you're looking at facilities with a global D-rate factor, right? So you may not be looking at the feasibility under 100% of everything being available. So some of these conditions and some of these overloads in relation to constraint could be a result of the magnitude of the transmission system that you're modeling, or the capacity that you assume within the SFT is available for this feasibility. So I wouldn't necessarily say that you're assuming it's an overload. It's not feasible based on the assumptions that you've made as to how much of the capacity is available for the feasibility test, and it's something less than 100%.
Okay, but then I think to some extent that gets back to the point I was trying to make before, that you need to make sure that when we're doing this, we're treating the different BAAs equally. And if, this particular BAA can submit larger numbers because they've sold more transmission capacity than the CAISO CRRs are going to allow to be done, that can be an issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Seems to me that might be what's going on here. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, and again, this is fictional. We were trying to illustrate how things could play out, but yeah, and that's part of the questions I think. Remember, we posed at the different stages of what's in and how are these. by looking simply at the allocation CRRs for the CAISO by area, is that comparable to looking at NITs plus the point-to-point rights, or should there be some additional assumptions on the uses of the CAISO system incorporated there? You know, maybe some assumptions about, historical assumptions about auction CRRs that you granted or something else. But those are kind of the questions we want to tease out here in terms of representing the systems and the rights within those systems in a common way or in an equitable way. So certainly appreciate any thoughts on that. Okay, looks like we're a little bit over time. So what we'll do, folks, is we're gonna schedule a follow-up session, just maybe in 1 or 2 hours, just to finish this next week, and it gives us a little bit of time to maybe act on some of these comparisons or some of the questions that you've asked. We may be able to act on some of that by the next meeting. But just to finish going through the rest of the presentation, answering any questions folks may have thoughts in the next week or so that they want to raise in the discussion. And so we'll look to schedule something next week, maybe for an hour or two, not a half a day session, but we'll see if we can find an hour or two to finish up. And like I said, we may be able to act on some of these things that you've suggested by then. And certainly if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out, but be on the lookout for a market notice. We'll announce something for an hour or two session next week to finish this out. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Christina. Thanks for everybody for bearing with us, and sorry that we went a little bit over time, but the dialogue was great, and the questions and the back and forth. So we wanted to make sure, allow room for that. So thank you for bearing with us, and I'll turn it over to Christina.
Thanks, Milos. As Milos noted, keep an eye out for a notice. We'll announce that meeting shortly. And in the meantime, meeting materials are posted on our initiative webpage linked here, and the comment template will be posted there soon too. Those will be due August 26th. And then we'll be scheduling future meeting for September as well, in addition to that one next week. Any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us at isostakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com. And in the interest of time, I won't go through our announcements, but feel free to refer to our posted slides to review those announcements. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's meeting. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, and all meeting materials are available on the initiative webpage. The video recording and comment template will be posted there soon. Thank you, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.